Chapter 1621. The 1,400 armored soldiers of the Li family surged to the gate of the imperial astronomer like a flood. They formed a tight formation like a barricade. In reality, there was only one person in front of the armor. The 1,400 elite soldiers who had specially changed into heavy armor, other than the two generals, Li Shougua and Li Chong'an, were all inside the gate of the imperial astronomer. Not a single one stepped out. Wearing this kind of large armor that weighed 50 catties was equivalent to abandoning all flexibility and mobility. Originally, it should have appeared in a special battlefield where the foot could stop the cavalry, relying on the innate weight of a single armor and the momentum condensed by a dense formation to resist the impact of the cavalry's charge. However, if an army was only equipped with heavy armor, large shields, and long spears and crossbows, no matter how steady they were, they would not be able to chase after the cavalry even if they succeeded in stopping the charge of the cavalry. They would only be able to defend and would not be able to expand the battle results. However, on today's strange battlefield, no one found the equipment of 1,400 people that defied common sense to be ridiculous. In fact, most of the soldiers wished that they could wear another set of armor that was suffocating after being worn for a long time. The 100 copper fish bagmasters that the Ministry of Justice had carefully selected from the rivers and lakes of Liang over the years were divided into two groups. They stood on the two wings of the infantry formation. Their positions were very particular. They were slightly scattered and tried to squeeze into the imperial astronomer's field. At the same time, they could coordinate with each other to prevent the enemy from circling around and entering the gate. At the ends of the wide street outside the imperial astronomer, the infantry and cavalry arrived. The 300 imperial guards with golden embroidered scabbards were the first to leave the cavalry. They walked as fast as they could, sticking close to the base of the wall and heading straight for the imperial astronomer. They blocked in front of the 1,400 infantry. The 1,200 cavalry that had been urgently transferred from the northern Jingji army had a majestic aura. They were far more in line with the title of a tiger wolf army than the western Jingji armies who Qi officer Qi Chonggong's western wall camp. They were in no hurry to charge. They stopped their horses at the two ends of the street and watched covetously. When they did not show up earlier, the sound of the horses' iron hooves hitting the street was like thunder. This already showed that part of the cavalry was terrifying enough to tear apart the enemy formation. This mysterious cavalry that had never appeared before the eyes of the capital was an elite cavalry that the general of the north, Ma Lulong, had spent most of his life and a huge amount of money to build. The location and number of soldiers were not recorded in the Ministry of War's files. The Ministry of Revenue of Liang did not have to bear the expenses of this cavalry. For the past 20 years, it had always been directly transferred from the treasury of the Kingdom of Zhao to support the shocking expenses of maintaining the operation of the cavalry. Historically, only the old Minister of War, Gu Zhentang, had the qualifications to know the inside story. When Chen Zhibao and Lu Baijie temporarily took over the Ministry of War, they were already unable to know too many details. They could only roughly know the growth of the cavalry, from the initial 300 to 500, 800, before Chen Zhibao stepped down as Minister of War and became a vassal. When Lu Baijie was demoted to Guangling Road as Jidushi, they could only speculate that this cavalry had shown signs of a sudden increase in numbers from other sources. This was because after the ascension of the emperor, especially after Bailiang's victory over Bei Mang, the Ministry of War and the Ministry of Revenue began to secretly deploy troops that were not legal. The Ministry of War selected soldiers, horses and armor, while the Ministry of Revenue had to pay a huge sum of money even if they had to tighten their belts. They didn't even dare to complain that they were poor. Moreover, the accounts had to be clean, so that even the doctors of the Ministry of Revenue who were not involved in the specific affairs of the Ministry of Revenue would not be able to see any clues. However, even Lu Baijie, who had once been the Minister of War, did not know that this cavalry had an extremely special significance to the three Zhao emperors of Liang other than its unstoppable and shocking combat ability. In the past 25 years, the cavalry had only secretly entered the capital 3 times. The first time was when Emperor Gaozu, who had established Liang's legitimate status, personally issued a secret order. Yang Taisui and Lu Haosher personally led the cavalry into the city. The second time was when Emperor Gaozu won the title of Meritorious Minister. The last time was when the previous Emperor Zhao Dun successfully wore the dragon robe that night. Led by half-inch tongue-bearing Ben Shi, they marched straight into Great Pea City and surrounded the mansion of Zhao Heng, who was still a prince at that time. Therefore, this was basically an army supporting the dragon of the Liang dynasty. The proprietress of Jiu Jiu restaurant looked around and for some reason, her smile was somewhat bleak. She muttered, Sun Ping, is this the military might of Liang that you wanted to create back then? She shook her head and collected her thoughts. She turned to Zhao Ji and mocked. What, you're still not leaving? Are you staying here to use your status as the Empress Dowager to tie down Su Fengnian so that he won't dare to go on a killing spree? Zhao Ji's expression was complicated. It was bleak, bitter, hateful, and fearful. In the end, he sighed and said self-deprecatingly, a long time ago, you were only Wu Su's friend, even though we knew each other earlier. Now, you only treat Wu Su's son as a junior. As for my two sons, be it Zhao Zhuan or Zhao Wu, you're not even willing to look at them. The proprietress seemed to have heard the biggest joke in the world. She said sternly, Fight, you've been fighting your whole life. Even today, you're still like this, wanting to fight for everything. Su Xiao overshadowed Zhao Dun. You're resentful. Wu Su's name shook the capital. You're not convinced. Now, Su Fengnian and Zhao Zhuan, these two youngsters, are upright, relying on their family's resources and abilities to wrestle with each other. What are you getting involved for? What can you do? Chapter 1622. Zhao Ji's face was devoid of any rich expression. There was a rare sadness and decadence. He turned to look at the imperial astronomer and said softly, Wu Su and Su Xiao are dead. My man is dead too. My son has become the emperor. What do I have to fight for? But you don't know what the imperial astronomer means to the Zhao family. The saber-armor Qi Lianhua has killed all the Qi cultivators from the imperial astronomer. It has already affected the fate of the Zhao family in Liang. If Su Fengnian insists on killing people today, he will destroy the formation built by the previous Taoist masters of Mount Longhu. As a result, the item sent to the capital by the previous saint of the Zhang family, Yan Xinggong, will be destroyed. Do you know what kind of catastrophe this will be? You definitely don't know why the Empress of Beimang's million-strong army didn't even break through Beiliang's pass. More than 300,000 people died, but she didn't immediately strip King of the southern courtyard Dong Zhuo of his position as the commander-in-chief. She was waiting for Beiliang to see the hope of another victory after the great victory. She wanted Su Fengnian to enter the capital to ask for the transport of grain and fodder. During this time, she came to the imperial astronomer to settle the old score and destroy Liang's foundation. Therefore, the people who are watching the imperial astronomer now are that old woman and Beimang's Taiping commandant, West Chu's Chao Chongqing, Nanjiang's Yan King Xiaobing, and Liao's Gu Jiantang. Of course, at this very moment, Mr. Xia and the King of Shu are standing in the imperial astronomer. Zhao Ji sighed and said, Is the imperial astronomer really just about the life and death of Su Fengnian and 3,000 soldiers? The Beiliang cavalry, West Chu's rebel army, Nanjiang's army, and Liao's border army are all involved. If we're not careful, Beimang's million-strong army will ruthlessly trample on the territory of the Central Plains. Even if they're eventually beaten back and driven back to the desert and grassland, how many people will die in Liang? The lady boss deliberately showed a frightened and terrified expression. She covered her chest and said, You scared me to death. The corners of Chen Yu's mouth curved slightly. The lady boss suddenly walked toward Zhao Ji. She raised her hand and was about to slap him. Zhao Ji remained motionless, his eyes cold. The lady boss smiled and retracted her hand. Forget it. I'm afraid of dirtying my hands. Although this old lady's Jojo Dojo is a small business, at least the things I make are clean. As for you big shots meddling in the affairs of the country, I don't give a damn about how you worry about the country and its people. In any case, I only know one thing. With Wu Su's son here, as long as Su Fengnian is alive, no matter if he is in Great Peace City or in Beiliang, no matter if he dies in the Imperial Astronomer today or on the battlefield in the future, in the end I feel satisfied. Because it makes me feel that not only is my man a fool who dares to risk universal condemnation, but also the father and son of the Su family, Su Xiao and Su Fengnian. The landlady walked towards the carriage, and Chen Yu followed closely behind. After the landlady sat down in the carriage, she looked at Chen Yu who was bending down to enter. She teased. Do you regret it now? Chen Yu's bright eyes were smiling as she looked at the landlady. She did not speak. The landlady said in bewilderment, If he was just a wretched lecher in the past and you did not like him, why are you still not moved? Chen Yu hesitated, her expression strange. She finally said, In the past, he only wanted to take me back to Beiliang and give me to his younger brother, Su Longxiang, to be his wife. Aunt Hong, do you think I would have agreed? My teacher, Huang Longshi, was depressed for many days when he learned of this news. The landlady resisted for a long time and then laughed. She wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes. This boy is even more of a bastard than the young Su Xiao. Zhao Ji also returned to the carriage. He saw his daughter with a sad expression. Princess Sui Zhu Zhao Fengya. Zhao Fengya lowered her head and said, "Fourth brother promised me not to marry Chen Jibao." Zhao Ji said angrily, "I do not agree." A horse galloped with all his might. He rushed past the armored cavalry at the end of the street and headed straight for Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian was only 20 steps away from the gate of the imperial astronomer. He sighed when he saw the young man who had fallen off his horse. Yan Qiji, the Huang men of the Hanlin Academy and the younger brother of the current empress, stood in front of Su Fengnian with a face full of sweat and tears. He choked with sobs and said, "Brother Nian, don't go any further." His Majesty said that Bailiang can lift the ban on the transport of 3 million dan. However, for every one of the 3,000 armored soldiers who dies today, 1,000 dan will be deducted. Su Fengnian said softly, "Go back and tell Marshal Addict Kong that we are still brothers." Yan Qiji suddenly grabbed Su Fengnian's sleeve and said with tears streaming down his face, "Brother Nian, don't go. I beg you." Su Fengnian said softly, "Don't worry, I won't die. No matter how many people I kill, Li Yang will not dare to take a single dan less from the transport of 3 million dan. Then Su Fengnian shook his sleeve and broke free from Yan Qiji's grip. He scolded jokingly, "Get out of here. If you stay here, I will be distracted." Yan Qiji was conflicted. He gritted his teeth and did not say anything else. He suddenly turned around and mounted his horse again. Without turning his head, the young man raised his hand and gave him a thumbs up. Su Fengnian looked at the imperial astronomer. He held the old cold blade hanging from the left side of his waist. His left hand pressed lightly on the hilt. A pale-faced leader with a copper fish bag took 5 or 6 steps out of the formation and shouted, "Halt! Immediately retreat 50 steps from the gate of the imperial astronomer." The next moment, this Ministry of Justice official flew high into the air like a kite with a broken string. He fell heavily into the infantry formation behind the gate. Unknowingly, Su Fengnian was standing where he was standing just now. "Bailiang, you can fight or die, but you cannot retreat." Even facing 1,000,000 troops of Bei Mang was like this, let alone 3,000 soldiers of the Zhao family. Chapter 1623. The 300 imperial guards held the hilts of their swords at the same time. Even though the masters of the Ministry of Justice were repelled by the young king and were ready to break into the imperial astronomer, the 300 Zhao kingdom's elites still didn't immediately draw their swords to kill the enemy. Of course, this didn't mean that the royal guards were all pretty but useless. It also didn't mean that the royal guards had a good temper. If it had been anyone else standing at the door, the 300 royal guards with the secret edict would have already rushed up and killed them. However, for some reason, the young man in front of them didn't wear the king's robe. After all, he was the son of General Su Xiao, who had 300,000 Northwest Iron Cavalry. He was also a martial arts grandmaster who was as famous as Chao Chongqing and Dong Tai. In terms of Jianghu, he was probably more famous than the other 2 Earth Immortals. Whoever drew their swords first would die first. The reason was that simple. The consecrator of the Ministry of Justice was sent flying. The deputy commander of the Imperial Guards could only brace himself and take his place. This tall and sturdy peerless master of the Imperial Guards had an imperial saber with the name, Eternal Hui Tian, hanging from his waist. During the reign of the late emperor, it took the palace master 5 years to forge 18 swords. The first 3 swords were kept in the palace guards. Only when the late emperor wore the golden dragon armor and participated in the hunt, he would wear one of them. Until the end of the Yonghui dynasty, in addition to the 3 palace guards, the Yonghui Tian 16, 17, and 18 were given 3 swords. According to the rules, the position of the palace guards commander was not hereditary, but the golden swords were hereditary. In other words, only those who sat in these 3 positions were qualified to wear the 3 swords. Gu Jiantang of the Great Pillar State, Chen Jibao of Shu, Lu Baijia of the Tongxi Sword Ferry, and Wu Zhongshuan, who had just arrived at the capital to attend the imperial court. Each of the 4 ministers of the Ministry of War of the Liang dynasty was bestowed with a sword and kept it for generations. Among the 8 generals of the 4 campaigns and 4 towns, other than Wu Zhongshuan, only the general of the northern campaign, Ma Lulong, received this honor. However, no one knew the exact number of the 5 insignia sabers. After the current emperor ascended to the throne, he ordered nearly 500 new imperial swords to be replicated according to the eternal Hui Heaven Sword. He personally named them the auspicious Talisman Day Swords, or Day Swords for short. The scabbard was made of wood with a golden peach leather sheath. The guard was an oval-shaped hollow plate made of iron and gold. There were 3 moving jade dragons inside, which were vivid and lifelike. The deputy commander of the royal guards took a deep breath. His tone was no longer as stiff as the unlucky guy from the Ministry of Justice. He said in a low voice, "King of Bailiang, please don't make things difficult for us." Su Fengnian, who was standing with his hand on the blade, did not make a sound. He did not take out the old cold blade that had been forged very early on. Instead, he gently tapped the hilt of the blade with his finger. It was like the sound of Bailiang's drum. Being able to become the deputy commander of the royal guards in Liang, he naturally would not be a coward. The burly man smiled. He had a bit of the spirit of a man who was willing to die for the emperor. He probably knew that he was going to die. He did not have the old-fashioned attitude of a servant beside the emperor in the palace. He looked at the northwest vassal in front of him and laughed heartily. Yang Dongping, a wild warrior from the old Dongyue countryside. 12 years ago, I entered the capital as a royal guard's guard. I have been away from Jianghu for 12 years. This is the last battle of my life. To be able to fight with the king of Bailiang, my life is not in vain. After saying his last words, Yang Dongping took out the eternal Hui Heaven No. 17 imperial sword, which he did not know who would be given to after his death. He shouted, "Meet the enemy!" 300 auspicious Talisman Day swords were neatly unsheathed. Yang Dongping took the lead and rushed forward with the sword. He roared, "Follow me to retreat from the enemy!" In an instant, 20 royal guards, including Yang Dongping, rushed forward one after another. In addition to maintaining the thickness of the formation outside the front gate of the Imperial Observatory, 100 royal guards did not move. The rest of the royal guards rushed to the left and right sides of the battlefield where the king of Bailiang and Yang Dongping were fighting. Obviously, they not only wanted to block the path of the young vassal, but also to block the path of retreat. More than 200 royal guards were extremely fast. For a moment, outside the gate of the Imperial Observatory, they were like a group of gorgeous butterflies fluttering in the air. The soldiers of the Li family who were inside the gate were dazzled and felt a chill down their spines. They asked themselves, how can an ordinary master survive such a fierce encirclement? Every step that Yang Dongping took caused the street to tremble. He didn't dare to jump up and slash down. When facing a martial grandmaster like the king of Northern Liang, who was much weaker than him, there were too many openings. He was destined to be killed in one move. Even though Yang Dongping was a first-stage Vajra realm martial artist, he only chose the most conservative move. He used his saber as a sword and stabbed the tip of his saber towards the king of Northern Liang's chest. Furthermore, he didn't use his full strength in this attack. He left 30% to 40% of his chi in case he couldn't defeat the king of Northern Liang. Although Yang Dongping had been away from the Jianghu of the Central Plains for more than 10 years and was not well known, he did not dare to slack off for a single day in the palace where countless martial arts manuals were stored. The path of martial arts was like sailing against the current. If you did not advance, you would fall behind. Yang Dongping, who had outstanding talent and constitution, had endured loneliness for more than 10 years. He did not care about the false reputation of being a Xian finger expert. Instead, he trained his Vajra realm cultivation to be extremely solid. The move before him was a combination of several supreme arts that had not been passed down. He had also received guidance from the former head of the ceremony directorate, Han Xianxia. This move of his had almost reached the realm of returning to simplicity. Yang Dongping did not dare to underestimate the new grandmasters in the world. However, he soon realized that he had not faced a top grandmaster for many years. Once he encountered a figure like the king of Bailiang, a slight mistake could be fatal. Yang Dongping's original intention was to avoid the king of Bailiang when he saw that the situation was not good. Otherwise, he would retreat on the spot. With the palace guards behind him filling in the positions and helping to delay the battle, he would still have a chance to survive. At that time, he could continue to fight. Unfortunately, Yang Dongping did not expect that he would die because he did not overestimate himself but seriously underestimated his opponent. The young man in white did not try to stop him. He allowed the Eternal Radiance No. 17 Imperial Sword, which could cut through iron like mud, to stab his chest. At that moment of choice, life and death were on the line. Yang Dongping, who thought that he had an opportunity, suddenly increased the qi between his 5 fingers. He stopped accumulating power, and the 3 jade dragons in the Imperial Sword's guard immediately let out sonorous dragon cries. When the tip of the Imperial Sword was about to touch the linen cloth on the young man's chest, it would be able to penetrate his body. Suddenly, a huge force was transmitted from the body of the Imperial Sword. The Imperial Sword in his hand was like hitting a mountain, like an egg hitting a stone. Yang Dongping had decisively given up this precious Eternal Radiance Imperial Sword. However, just as he let go, the king of Beiliang had already stretched out his palm. Yang Dongping's whole body seemed to have been hit violently by a battering ram. His body was still slightly moving forward, but his whole chest instantly caved in and a large part of his back protruded at the same time. Yang Dongping, who was in the 1st grade Vajra realm and the deputy commander of the palace guards, died on the spot. Yang Dongping's body flew out and hit a guard who was waiting for an opportunity to pounce on the young lord. The unparalleled momentum caused the god to have no time to dodge, and a large amount of blood splattered wantonly in his chest. There was a guard behind him who tried to reach out and stop his seriously injured colleague. With a crack, his arm exploded. There was no chance for him to regret. The 2 people who were retreating without any signs of weakening slammed into him. Then, the 3 corpses flew out together and slid out on the ground. The corpses slowly stopped in front of 100 palace guards who were as motionless as mountains. On the ground, a scarlet blood flowed. The dead were already dead, and the living were a ghastly sight. After Yang Dongping was killed by a palm, the Eternal Radiance Heaven Blade, which was supposed to be passed to the next deputy commander of the palace guards after the war, flew out of his hand. Su Fengnian casually waved it. The Imperial Sword that was thrown high out of its sheath paused for a moment, and then began to fly like a flying sword controlled by a sword immortal. Chapter 1624. The saber first swept across the neck of a palace guard, and in the next moment, it pierced through the shoulder of his colleague beside him. It entered the left shoulder and came out the right shoulder. A nearby guard who had jumped high with his saber was cut in half by the saber. It formed a large arc around Su Fengnian. After all, this group of palace guards was one of the few experts in the palace. In the arc of Jianghu 17, there was no lack of people who used their sabers to save their lives or intercept. However, without exception, as long as they used their sabers, the temporarily ownerless Jianghu 17 was unscathed. However, the day sabers in the hands of the other guards shattered on the spot. Without seeing Su Fengnian move, Jianghu 17 began to draw a second arc with a larger range. At the same time, in the first big circle around Su Fengnian, the sabers of all the palace guards who died in battle before they could use their sabers also began to leave the ground and fly into the air, joining the arc. In the second arc, which was even farther away from Su Fengnian's body, there was an ear-piercing sound of the day's saber exploding and breaking, and corpses kept falling to the ground. The more than 160 palace guards who were still alive were forced to stand outside the arc. It seemed that they were surrounding the king of Beiliang, who had not really used his saber yet. In fact, they could not even catch the corner of the young king's clothes. When Su Fengnian began to move forward, the arc that was visible but traceable suddenly rippled and changed. Occasionally, it would jump out of the arc and kill a certain guard before returning to the arc. More than 20 guards who were caught off guard were killed immediately. After someone shouted, "Break the array together!" the palace guards outside the circle began to slash at the arc with no regard for their lives. Ordinary people would not be able to detect a breath. For an ordinary martial artist who had reached a high level in martial arts, a single breath was like a raindrop falling on the roof, disappearing as soon as it touched the ground. However, a martial arts grandmaster's breath was as long as a river. Ever since he personally created the division of martial artists into the 1st grade and the 4th realm, there was a saying that his body could travel 800 miles in an instant. When experts of similar strength fought against each other, it was mostly a battle of qi. Whoever had a longer breath would often be in an invincible position, and whoever had a shorter breath would be able to seize the fleeting opportunity faster, thus resulting in life and death for the other party. No matter what, the rest of the Imperial Guards found that they could not let the young king continue to finish everything in one go, comfortably. Su Fengnian continued forward, ignoring the Imperial Guards who were trying their best to break the formation. He turned his head and looked at Su Yanbing, who was holding the instant spear. The latter smiled and nodded. Su Yanbing's accompanying this time was not to help kill people, and was not even to help Su Fengnian block the armored cavalry at the two ends of the street. These people would all be left to Su Fengnian, who had reached a new level in the Mawei post station, to deal with himself. But before Su Fengnian entered the Imperial Astronomer, he would hold back 2 people and 2 formations. Su Fengnian was today in Great Peace City. Just like when Wang Xianji was standing in Martial Emperor City. This kind of state of mind was related to the level of martial cultivation, but at the same time, it was not very related. But whether or not one had this kind of state of mind, it would have an effect on one's cultivation. Previously, Su Fengnian had truly managed to fight 1 against 2 people at the last moment of Mawei. This had already explained everything. At the time, Chao Chongqing, Luo Yang, Wu Jian, Shen Yuan Qingfeng and the others had done it intentionally. Dong Tai, Chen Zhibao, Yu Groom, Chai Qingshan and the others had done it unintentionally. On the empty street, Su Yanbing lightly inhaled, the shaft of the spear in his hand trembling. This man who had always been seriously neglected in the Liang dynasty and the Jianghu of the Central Plains, a middle-aged martial artist who had never been heard of, who had never left Beiliang's territory, and who did not have many illustrious battle records, raised his head to look at the heavenly connecting platform of the Imperial Astronomer. Chen Zhibao, Xie Guanyin, who will come first? Or together? On the heavenly connecting platform, Xie Guanyin said helplessly, "Of the 2 of us, the one who can fight, you are not willing to act, the one who can run, I can't run right now. What should I do? My head hurts." Chen Zhibao said indifferently, "There are 2 big arrays in the Imperial Astronomer. The one on Dragon Tiger Mountain can be used to imprison Su Yanbing." Xie Guanyin sighed, although there are more than 60 Imperial Jade Seals in the spring and autumn period, and the influence of Duke Yanqing's presence is not big, but without the big array on Dragon Tiger Mountain to reduce Su Fengnian's strength, the effect will be very different. The most important thing is that you are not willing to act. Chen Zhibao interrupted the words of the ambitious scholar. "You should know that Su Fengnian came here to do something that I would have done in the future. I'm just standing here, and that's already giving you a lot of face. If you want to take the opportunity to destroy Beiliang's fate, then do it with your own ability." Xie Guanyin said self-mockingly, I know. Our cooperation is like asking a tiger for its skin. I, Xie Guanyin, know it in my heart." At this time, Jin Sinan, who had been the leader of the Qi cultivators in the north for 20 years, suddenly ran into the Tongtian platform, looking anxious. Xie Guanyin frowned, his fingers quickly pinched in his sleeves, and said to himself, "It is not strange that Duke Yanqing suddenly left the capital, but other than that, what other big changes can there be?" Jin Sinan's face was pale, and he said sadly, "Mr. Xie, I just went to the Imperial Treasury and found that Duke Yanqing had taken away the central seal that symbolizes the fate of the Confucian school." Xie Guanyin was stunned at first, then he laughed, his sleeves shook, looked to the south, and said in high spirits, Duke Yanqing, do you really think that by doing such a rebellious thing, you can stop me, Xie Guanyin? You are just trying to be clever and make a fool of yourself. You're just a bunch of stubborn scholars." On the post road, in a simple carriage from the north to the south, a middle-aged Confucian scholar and a little attendant were sitting in the carriage. The little attendant looked at his teacher who was fidgety for the first time, and could not think of anything in the world that could make his teacher feel uneasy. Finally, the little attendant could not help but ask curiously, "Mister, what's wrong?" Before the teacher could give an answer, the little attendant thought that he had found the answer, and he grinned. "Could it be that you are not acclimatized to the capital and have a stomachache?" The middle-aged Confucian scholar had a small wooden box with simple carvings on his knees. After hearing the little attendant's teasing, he remained calm. The little attendant was worried, and he asked with a bitter face, "Mister, are you worried about the world's affairs? Can I share your worries?" Soon the little attendant sighed heavily and said, "Of course not, I don't even have scholarly honors now." The middle-aged Confucian scholar smiled and said, "Everyone is responsible for the rise and fall of the world. Whether or not one has the ability is secondary. Whether or not one has morals in one's heart, it comes before one's ability." The little attendant's face still did not look better. "I have read so many sages with you, of course I know these principles." The Confucian scholar smiled and said, "This time you have to accompany me to the capital. In the end, you want to slack off on your homework and study for me." The little attendant said, "Oh," and began to read aloud the 10 family precepts that the teacher had summed up with his life's efforts. The teacher's family precepts were the family precepts of all the scholars in the world. Inside and outside the carriage, the sound of reading was loud. The middle-aged Confucian scholar began to close his eyes and concentrate. A scholar listened to the sound of reading. When you see a virtuous person, you should follow him. When you see a virtuous person, you should reflect on yourself. Do not do to others what you do not want to be done to yourself. I reflect on myself 3 times a day. When the little attendant read the last sentence of the 10 precepts, a scholar must be resolute. The burden is heavy, and the road is long. The middle-aged Confucian scholar followed and said, a scholar must be resolute. The burden is heavy, and the road is long. Then he suddenly opened his eyes and patted the little attendant's shoulder. His eyes were firm and he slowly said, because the burden is heavy and the road is long, we scholars should remember one thing more. A scholar must be resolute. The little attendant did not know the inside story, but he nodded hard. It was the middle-aged Confucian scholar of the current Duke Yanxing. He smiled and opened the box. It was empty. The Duke Yanxing said softly, Su Fengnian, with you, Beiliang, fighting to the death in front, the central plains will be resolute behind. Chapter 1625. The top chi cultivator in the north, Xianxia, stood beside Xie Guaniying and Chen Jibao. He looked down at the scene outside the gate of the imperial astronomer. Looking at the young vassal king who was still suppressing his aura despite being trapped in the battle, he suddenly felt generous. Why bother? Since you have already killed your way to the imperial astronomer, why don't you give it your all? Xianxia, as the head of the imperial astronomer and the head of the imperial astronomer, knew a lot of inside information that even the officials in the capital did not know. For example, the existence of the 2 big formations was the cornerstone of the battle against top martial artists like Wang Xianji and Chao Chongqing. Beimang's west capital once had a huge vat that hid a flood dragon, which could be used to search for all kinds of strange phenomena in the human world. The imperial astronomer's methods were not bad, or even better. Xianxia also knew that this time, in order to target the young man surnamed Su, he could be said to be unscrupulous. In Mr. Xie's plan, the 300 palace guards were not chosen purely because of the combat power of these guards, but because they were closely related to the fate of the Zhao family in Liang. In particular, he persuaded the current emperor to allow the 1,200 heavy cavalry trained by Ma Lulong to rush into the capital in hopes of wearing down Su Fengnian's own fate. As the top chi diviner, Xianxia knew about fate and fate. It seemed illusory, but in short, it was the will of the people. It was the power of heaven and earth. On the contrary, it was no longer the fate of heaven. It was the fate that heroes were not free, and everything came to an end. Therefore, Mr. Xie was really cruel and merciless. Not only did he ignore the life and death of the 3,000 soldiers, but he also wanted to destroy the fate that Beiliang had painstakingly gathered by Su Fengnian. At that time, Qi Jiajia's one sword of going Liang did not make Su Fengnian use Beiliang's fate. The young vassal king risked his life to prevent the one sword of 1,000 miles from entering Yuzhou. This time, Mr. Xie was forcing Su Fengnian to make a difficult choice. Would he let his emotions affect his decision, barge into the imperial astronomer, and resist the 2 big formations regardless of the consequences? Or would he leave some suspense for Beimang, which was in the middle of Beiliang's struggle for power in the central plains? Now it seemed that compared to the time when Qi Jiajia, one man and one sword, died one after another, Su Fengnian's state of mind had changed. He no longer had his hands and feet tied, nor did he have any misgivings. Although he was on the opposing side of the young vassal king, when Xianxia saw the scene at the door, he couldn't help but feel sincere admiration. With this young man leading the new Jianghu of Liang, Li Yufu, Qi Xianxia, and Shenyuan Qingfeng, all of them were truly impressive. Outside the imperial observatory, Dong Tai had just shown his magnificent skill of killing 1,000 people and 1,000 swords in an instant in Taiyan City yesterday. Today, Su Fengnian was using what he had learned. A young vassal king who had forcefully borrowed the day sword appeared in front of each of the 100 palace guards standing outside the door. Almost all of the palace guards were repelled by one move, and they all crashed into the outer wall. The entire thick wall rumbled and was on the verge of collapsing. If there were some valiant guards who didn't want to retreat and tried to take back their swords to continue blocking the road, they were quickly stabbed by a sword and nailed into the wall along with their swords. Of the 300 palace guards that Yang Dongping had brought, less than 100 were still alive. Yang Dongping was the first to die in battle. The 2 carriages had just turned the corner at the end of the street and had just brushed shoulders with the charging cavalry. On one of the carriages, Chen Yu lifted the curtain and saw through the gap that at the very back of the cavalry, There were many tall and large cavalry who were donning armor and getting on their horses with the help of the supporting troops. Other than that, there were also hundreds of idle war horses that no one had ridden. Chen Yu said in surprise, "I thought that this troop had entered Taiyan City as an armored cavalry." The proprietress of the Jiu restaurant couldn't help but laugh. "Silly girl, this is a heavy cavalry that has only appeared a few times in the wars of the spring and autumn period. When they travel, they definitely won't wear armor. Before they face the enemy, the war horses they ride will definitely be supporting horses. Otherwise, if both the men and horses wear armor, the cavalry and the war horses won't be able to take it after a long time. Let alone being able to destroy everything on the battlefield and play a crucial role in deciding the battle, they probably would have collapsed from exhaustion before they could even charge. Wearing armor before the battle is a rule of heavy cavalry. Only then will they have enough strength to tear apart the enemy's most dense and important formation. But even so, they cherish the strength of the war horses. On the battlefield, it's already very impressive to be able to carry out 2 long-distance charges while maintaining an orderly formation. As for using 1,000-man heavy cavalry in a roundabout way, that's just a novel and can't be taken seriously." Chen Yu reluctantly pulled back her gaze and put down the curtain. She sighed emotionally. "Aunt Hong, so that's how it is. In the past, I thought that heavy cavalry meant that they could wear armor and run for thousands of kilometers." The lady boss's eyes were absent-minded. She said softly, "Only when you go to Bailiang and see them kill with your own eyes will you know how valiant a true heavy cavalry is." Actually, I only heard it casually from my man back then. But at that time, Su Xiao used the strength of alcohol to pat his chest and say some heroic words that reached the clouds. He said that one day in this life, he would lead over 100,000 elite cavalry and beat 1,000,000 Beimang barbarians until they were cowards who didn't even dare to step out of their homes. Back then, my man Sun Ping and Su Xiao, one a poor scholar who had no money and the other a boor who had to look at the Ministry of War's face, could actually drink together and brag without thinking. It was already strange enough. Wu Su and I, 2 women, actually felt quite helpless every time we saw them putting on that cocky appearance of a hero in the world at the table. Xie Guaniying suddenly joked, "Are you really not going to fight with Su Yambing? Or are you saying that you'll wait until you've taken that step and half a step respectively before you have a life-and-death battle like Su Fengnian and Wang Xianji? But let me say this first. This kind of opportunity might not come. It's the same for both you and him." Chen Zhibao stretched out his hand. A beam of light suddenly descended from the sky and landed on the heaven-reaching platform. Chapter 1626. Chen Zhibao held the plum wine and pulled it out gently. His figure flashed and disappeared. Even though Xianxia had ascended to the great celestial state, he still couldn't help but take a step back when the long spear landed on the ground. At that moment, the Qi cultivator grandmaster understood a principle. Xianxia's state was like an ant in the eyes of Su Fengnian, Chen Zhibao, and Su Yambing. Xie Guaniying turned and threw a sharp look at Xianxian. The latter calmed down and nodded. He went downstairs in his white robe. In a hidden attic of the imperial astronomer, the northern prime minister of the Liang dynasty, Wu Lingsu, who was wearing a purple-gold robe, followed Xianxian into the building. The 2 straightened their clothes and took an incense stick from the hands of 2 old Taoists who had been guarding the building for many years. They walked to a table carved from red sandalwood. On the table, there was an ancient incense burner. There was an incense stick as thick as a child's arm in the burner all year round. The incense stick burned continuously. Before Xianxian came, not only did he put on the deputy uniform of the imperial astronomer, he also borrowed the badge of the head of the imperial astronomer and hung it on his waist. Wu Lingsu, on the other hand, went to great lengths to bring the golden edict that the court had issued to him. The edict was stamped with the vermilion seal of the Emperor's 3 seals and the Emperor's 3 seals. It was the Emperor's seal that was specially used to worship the gods. Xianxian and Wu Lingsu put the incense sticks in their hands on the left and right sides of the burner respectfully. The 2 spoke at the same time. Xianxian folded his hands and looked straight ahead. He said in a low voice, "Enforcing justice on behalf of heaven." Wu Lingsu looked down and bowed. "To suppress the 4 barbarians." The wall behind the burner was shrouded in layers of smoke. One could vaguely see solemn portraits that were as tall as real people hanging on the wall. As Xianxian and Wu Lingsu finished speaking, the thick smoke gradually dissipated. The portraits that didn't reveal themselves started to show their true faces. They didn't reveal their true faces. The portraits on the wall were of the ascended Taoist masters of the Dragon Tiger Mountain. Xianxia, An's expression was complicated. It was just like what Xie Guanyin had said to him before. Don't ask if there are gods in the world. How many people have ascended since ancient times? In that case, the real people depicted in the portraits were the real people who had ascended. They were either riding dragons, cranes, or phoenixes. People only knew that the celestial masters of Longhu Mountain and the Zhao family of Liang had the same surname. However, the history between them could be traced back to the founding emperor of Liang. Because of Wudong Mountain, Zhao Huangchao, who was born a noble, had no choice but to conceal his identity in Mount Longhu and cultivate in seclusion. He raised an evil dragon in Earthlung Mountain to restrain the northwest black tortoise. The 3 incense sticks in the incense burner that were originally dimly lit suddenly blossomed into 3 brilliant flames. Especially the incense stick in the middle. It burned out at a speed visible to the naked eye. When the incense burned out, the paintings on the wall seemed to move without any wind. The sound of books being flipped could be heard in the building. The 2 brand new portraits hanging on the left and right were the first to shake, and they were also the first to show signs of abnormalities. In the air 3 inches outside of the portraits, mysterious ripples appeared. 2 Taoist masters in yellow and purple Taoist robes broke out of the mirror. Their figures were illusory as they walked out of the portraits and the mirror. They floated to the ground and walked out of the building. One by one, the sage-like Taoist masters landed on the ground and floated out of the door. Some of them were carrying ancient swords, some were holding purple gold books, and some were holding horsetail whisks. Among the last 3, one of them was riding an auspicious white deer and singing generously. After the white deer immortal, 2 immortals appeared side by side. One of them had a delicate face, a lotus crown on his head, and a long-sleeved crane cloak. Unlike the previous immortals, whether it was his aura or his eyes, there was a trace of "Heaven and earth pity me, I pity all living things." The other immortal who came with him was extremely young. He looked about 30 years old, and there was a murderous aura between his brows. After he landed, he raised his hand and held a talisman sword, Yulei, that had been enshrined in the building for hundreds of years in his hand. He weighed it in his hand and the corner of his mouth curled up. Jin Sinan maintained a respectful posture with his hands folded and looked straight ahead. Wu Lingsu, who was recognized by everyone in the Liyang imperial court as a lucky person, was trembling in fear and sweating profusely. One by one, the immortals appeared at the imperial observatory in the mortal realm. Most of them passed through the Li family's infantry formation and arrived at the entrance of the imperial observatory. Apart from 2 of the armored soldiers, whose eyes suddenly became unfocused, and then their bodies suddenly emitted a purple gold light, turning their eyes golden and imposing, the rest of the immortals lined up at the entrance. They stood in the exact same position as the portraits in the building. The immortals who had replaced the 300 imperial guards all had different expressions on their faces. An immortal on the right whose feet were shrouded in purple mist turned to look at the newly ascended sect master of Mount Longhu, Xianxia, and asked with a smile, "Is this the one?" With each word, the people around the gate of the imperial observatory seemed to hear the sound of nature. Xianxia nodded slightly. "It is this person who abandoned the true body of the Xuanwu great emperor in this world and cut off his own path to immortality." The immortal surrounded by purple clouds frowned slightly and angrily stared at the young man in mourning dress. He rebuked, "Treacherous." On the far left, the old perfected master Zhao Shi, who had ascended with Xianxia, was also talking to a grandmaster beside him. When the latter heard that it was this person who had blocked Zhao Huangchao's path to immortality, he was furious. Flying swords formed a formation around him and he softly shouted, "How dare you!" When this immortal said these 2 words, the bells and drums of all the Taoist temples in the capital suddenly rang. Changming Great Peace City. An immortal stood in the middle. Golden armor could be vaguely seen under his loose robe. The immortal glanced at the charging cavalry on the left side of the street and smiled slightly. A ball of golden light exploded and flew toward one of the cavalry generals. The cavalry was instantly possessed by an immortal. His entire body shone brightly and shone brightly. The golden-armored immortal urged his horse forward. The immortals were in front. Su Fengnian looked at these high and mighty immortals expressionlessly. He did not say anything and only raised the cold blade in his hand. That was all. Chapter 1627. In novels about immortals and supernatural beings, the description of those who achieved the Tao after a rough journey of cultivation would usually be given the title of immortal class, which meant that they had a place in the heavens. Actually, in the end, it was the same as those scholars in the world who had obtained scholarly honors in the imperial examinations and obtained a position in the imperial court or the throne room. The immortals in front of the gate of the imperial astronomer really opened the eyes of the soldiers of the Li family. Living under the feet of the emperor, they could see all kinds of strange people and things. For example, Jianghu flew through the 18 gates with a sword. Many people in the capital were lucky enough to see it with their own eyes. However, Jianghu's style was at most like a banished immortal. It was definitely the first time they saw a real immortal. Moreover, dozens of immortals in Taoist robes appeared in front of them in one breath. It was too much for the eyes to take in. All the soldiers of the Li family didn't dare to breathe loudly. They all widened their eyes and stared hard at those tall and low figures. Enemies were bound to meet. The young immortal in the middle was holding a talisman sword, Yulei. It was a Taoist treasure that was as famous as Wudong sword maniac Wang Xiaoping's Shinshu. Probably because it was too precious, it was hidden deep in the imperial astronomer in the capital. After a long time, people only knew about Shinshu and not Yulei. On the other hand, Wudong Mountain didn't have the habit of keeping treasures. Even a treasure like Lu Zu's relic was casually hung on the corner of the eaves. When Xianxia went to Wudong Mountain to make trouble, he just took a few glances at the relic. At that time, the young chief Hong Shixiang also lent it to him. Xianxia felt that it was too childish and didn't accept it. Although Wudong Mountain and Dragon Tiger Mountain were both Taoist ancestral courts, the path of cultivation was poles apart. The latter climbed to the heavens step by step and only wanted to ascend. The former chief in the past 100 years, from Huang Manshan and Wang Zhonglo to Hong Shixiang and Li Yufu, all of them diligently traveled the world. There was no such thing as yellow and purple nobles and feather-clothed ministers. At this time, the sword-carrying immortal was very similar to Xianxia, the current leader of the Dragon Tiger Mountain, in terms of appearance and demeanor. However, compared with the latter who was like a piece of jade, this young Taoist with strong immortal qi was more aggressive. He was like a well-carved national seal with countless golden talismans flashing around his body. In fact, the ancestor that Xianxia had invited to the Spring God Lake many years ago was this person. But at that time, the immortal's face was blurred, and Bailiang Prince invited the more magnificent Jianghu Great Emperor Dharma image, which immediately broke Xianxia's invitation. Except for the few disciples of the Zhao family in Dragon Tiger Mountain, almost no one knew who Xianxia's ancestor was. Compared with the other three immortals who came down from Dragon Tiger Mountain who were aggressive, the sword-carrying immortal faced the young king with a complicated look in his eyes. There was no anger on his face. He seemed to not see that the golden-armored immortal had already charged at the king of Bailiang. He slowly said, "The father and son of the Su family really can't stop." At the same time, the golden-armored general who was possessed by the immortal had already arrived. When he was 50 steps away from Su Fengnian, he reached out his hand and casually grabbed in the air. A golden spear surrounded by purple lightning appeared in his hand. The spear body was engraved with obscure Taoist cloud patterns. The golden-armored immortal shouted and thrust the spear at Su Fengnian's head. Su Fengnian didn't turn around. He leaned back slightly and dodged the spear. At the same time, he raised his hand and casually grasped the golden spear. Not only were there lightning flashing between his fingers, but his entire arm was shrouded in dazzling golden light and purple clouds. After the golden-armored immortal was caught by the spear, his warhorse couldn't move forward anymore. The immortal tried to smash the mortal's head with a sweeping posture, but the spear didn't move at all. Under the shock of qi, the golden armor that symbolized the immortal's heavenly power trembled. Su Fengnian increased the strength of his 5 fingers. The golden spear made a loud bang and was directly broken by him. The golden-armored immortal's dazzling golden color suddenly dimmed. He angrily shouted, "How dare you!" Su Fengnian finally turned his head and looked at the ascended immortal wrapped in golden light. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Since both of you have descended to the mortal world, let's get off the horse together." Su Fengnian pulled the broken spear to his right. The golden-armored immortal, who didn't want to let go of the spear, was pulled off the horse. The latter obviously realized that something was wrong. When he left the horse's back, he let go of the spear and raised his hand high, as if he wanted to use something to suppress this audacious mortal. Sure enough, a square Taoist seal with dazzling thunderlight hovered above the golden-armored immortal's hand. It looked like the seal of the thunderbolt deity recorded in the Taoist scriptures. He smashed it down heavily on Su Fengnian's head. At the same time, the immortal said in a deep voice, "Heavenly Thunder Blast." Su Fengnian didn't make any big movements with the blade in his left hand. He just made a gesture with the tip of the blade slightly raised. The three immortals with the Yulei sword, the lotus crown on their heads, and the white deer at the gate of the Imperial Observatory seemed to want to say something at the same time. Among them, the lotus crown immortal sighed slightly. The immortal riding the white deer almost couldn't help but attack. Su Fengnian's move was Gu Jiantang's famous move, the Thunderheart. In the last decade, Gu Jiantang, who rarely acted, only used this move to return a bow to the official when Chao Chongqing entered the Great Peace Imperial Palace with Jiang and I. Later, Jiang Fuding, who had a special status, provoked Su Fengnian and used it once against Su Fengnian. At this moment, Su Fengnian used the Thunderheart with a force far more shocking than Jiang Fuding's. Even Jiang Fuding, who had always been proud of his talent, would feel ashamed of his inferiority if he saw this. The immortal in golden armor was just about to smash down with the Thunderheart seal when his entire body seemed to be struck by lightning. He flew into the sky. The seal that had just formed and hadn't shown the majesty of the heavenly Tao also disappeared. Su Fengnian's sleeves moved slightly. He rose from the ground and twisted his body. His sleeves fluttered in the wind, showing the endless elegance of the #1 person in the world. Su Fengnian appeared above the immortal in golden armor. He also reached out with his palm. His 5 fingers were also spread. However, he didn't use the Dharma seal. Instead, he simply slapped down at the immortal. There was an ancient poem that said, "The immortal touched my head and tied my hair to teach me longevity." These words contained the true essence of Taoism, causing countless cultivators in the mortal world to yearn for it. Many people visited famous mountains and great rivers just to see the true appearance of the immortals and learn the art of immortality. But today, the young vassal king in white robes, after being angrily reprimanded by the immortal, did something truly disgraceful. "I touched the immortal's head. I broke longevity with one hand." Chapter 1628. The golden-armored immortal didn't even have time to defend himself before he was smashed to the ground by this extremely majestic palm strike. In the blink of an eye, the golden light around the immortal's body dissipated at an extremely fast speed. When the immortal's possessed body smashed a large hole in the ground, the golden armor he wore before was gone except for the remaining golden light in his eyes. The immortal's body was mostly restored to a mortal's body. He was bleeding from his 7 orifices and dying. Su Fengnian stood expressionlessly at the edge of the large hole, looking down at the general of the heavy cavalry, who could not escape death no matter what. Unless one had reached the Vajra or heavenly image realm, one would not be able to bear the burden and die when carrying the body of a banished immortal. The people of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism were different from the ordinary martial artists of Jianghu. Just like the eminent monks of Buddhism who reached the first pin realm of the Vajra realm, the Taoist grandmasters often reached the finger mystery realm as soon as they reached the first pin realm. This was also a unique opportunity that ordinary people could not envy. However, when facing an enemy of the same realm, it was natural to advance step by step. Pure martial artists were better at fighting. For example, the early grandmasters of martial arts like Han Xianxia and Shen Yuan Pan could kill 2 or 3 of them without any suspense, let alone an eminent monk of Vajra realm or a Zhenren of finger mystery realm. Therefore, on the path of cultivation, there were fast and slow and there were gains and losses. It all depended on how one chose. But generally speaking, everyone had their own opportunities. Jiang Ni's swordsmanship improved by leaps and bounds. Shen Yuan Qingfeng had a series of fortuitous encounters and achieved great success in martial arts. Zhao Ningxin's failure to invite the deity was a blessing in disguise. Jiang Fuding, whose state of mind was damaged, opened a new path after hitting the tide. Chen Zhibao even reaped the benefits of the fishermen several times. Xie Guanying and Shen Yuan Jingqing could achieve great realms just by reading books. The burly cavalry general was completely dead. Then, a bright white rainbow rose from the large hole and swiftly swept toward the sky. "I came from the sky. I will go to the sky. What can mortals do to me?" It was a pity that he met Su Fengnian, who had killed celestial beings and sky dragons. In the past, the Taoist great immortal Zhao Xuansu, who had returned to simplicity, appeared in the world with a young face. He almost escaped Li Chungang and successfully killed Su Fengnian. However, even though he was killed by the flying sword of the peach blossom sword god Dong Tai, he still viciously attacked Su Fengnian before his death. The Taoist great immortal Zhao Xuansu. He met the Dong Tai who had traveled thousands of miles to borrow a sword and set sail to visit immortals. Even Zhao Xuansu, who was only a hair's breadth away from becoming an immortal, couldn't escape. Now this immortal of Mount Longhu who had ascended to immortality at some unknown time and who himself was restricted by the rules of celestial being descending to the mortal world had encountered Su Fengnian, who was at the peak of his spirit, as if he was in martial emperor city, facing all the heroes of the world. Before Su Fengnian had made his move, many of the immortals gathered at the gate of the Imperial Observatory were simultaneously furious. The flying sword immortal standing next to Zhao Shi was even more furious. When his thunderous voice rang out, "How dare this brat?" the immortal had already disappeared without a trace. In the next moment, many of the immortals near the left and right raised their heads to see this scene. They were somewhat shocked. Then, they looked at each other in dismay and began to whisper to each other. It turned out that after the flying sword immortal blocked Su Fengnian's attack, the streak of white light was still cut in half by a bolt of thunder square that appeared out of nowhere. From then on, it dissipated between heaven and earth. Not far away, the two cavalry troops that had already begun their charge had no choice but to stop their war horses. Then, they unwillingly turned around and retreated from the battlefield. Even though they were the greatest killing machines on the battlefield, they didn't dare to act rashly when two groups of immortals were fighting in front of them. In front of Su Fengnian, thousands of purple-gold flying swords poured down like a torrential downpour. Following closely behind was the immortal who was riding on a huge flying sword. He put two fingers together in front of his chest and uttered a mantra. Su Fengnian took a step forward and a step back. His knees were slightly bent. He held the blade in his left hand and pointed the tip of the blade slightly upward. He pointed the blade at the immortal who was riding on the sword. His right hand also put two fingers on the side of the blade and said softly, "Break the formation." Without the majestic flying sword sprinkling down like rain, without the majestic Taoist mantra, Su Fengnian simply raised his blade and said two simple words. A green upstanding chi, like a swimming dragon, directly broke through the dense sword formation that was falling from the sky and crashed into the immortal who was riding on the high ground. The immortal's expression changed dramatically as he made a gesture with his fingers. A crystal-clear tablet floated in front of his chest. The tablet was the most popular item in the imperial court of Dafeng dynasty. Now that the Liang dynasty had unified the spring and autumn period, it was gradually abandoned. According to the laws of Dafeng dynasty, the emperor used jade tablets, the vassals used ivory tablets, and the scholar officials used bamboo tablets. Because Dafeng dynasty worshipped Elder Huang, they specially granted the Taoist who was conferred the title of immortal to use jade tablets. However, in the Dafeng dynasty, there were only a handful of Taoist priests who were conferred the title of immortal. According to historical records, there were a total of 8 immortals in Dafeng. Unlike the Liang dynasty, the previous emperors of Dafeng dynasty worshipped Wudong and demoted dragon and tiger, so the 7 immortals came from Wudong Mountain. Only one Taoist priest of Dragon and Tiger Mountain, Zhao Zhengzhen, was conferred the title of Immortal Dong Su. In the last years of Dafeng dynasty, this famous immortal of Dragon and Tiger Mountain had various legends of riding a sword in the sky. Presumably, the immortal sword who returned to the mortal world this time was the Immortal Dong Su, Zhao Zhengzhen, who was rumored to have ascended with one foot on a sword and the other on a tablet during the last years of Dafeng dynasty. After the jade tablet appeared, it came and went in a hurry. The green upstanding chi and the pure white jade tablet collided with a loud bang, causing a strange phenomenon that seemed to shake heaven and earth. Not to mention the Li family's armored soldiers and the cavalry on the street couldn't help but cover their ears in pain. Even the sleeves of many immortals began to flutter backward. Under the head-on collision, the jade shattered. The green upstanding chi, wrapped in wind and thunder, shattered the jade tablet and pierced through the immortal's body into the sky. The sound of wind and thunder lingered in the air. It echoed in the sky for a long time. Immortal Zhao Zhengzhen's outcome was the same as the golden armored immortal from before. Immortal Zenrins were not immortal. Without the support of their masters, the rain of swords instantly disappeared. For a moment, heaven and earth were clear. The two immortals had no power to fight back. Su Fengnian turned to dust with a snap of his fingers. The immortals looked at each other. There was no fear on their faces, only anger. No less than 30 immortals floated out together. Su Fengnian laughed softly and said, "So what if you have more people?" Facing a group of immortals, I am very familiar with the situation. I have not traveled the Jianghu 3 times for nothing. Su Fengmian did something that the immortals found inconceivable. He sheathed his saber. He opened his arms and suddenly raised them up. Rise. The second year of auspicious talisman. There was a reign of swords in Great Peace City. The second year of auspicious talisman had yet to enter winter. There was another reign of swords in Great Peace City. That time they fell from the sky. There was a suspicion that the thunder was big but the rain was small. Hundreds of thousands of flying swords fell in the rain but did not hurt anyone. Earlier, when they landed and seemed to dissipate, they had quietly gathered near the imperial astronomer. This time from the ground to the sky. If they wanted to kill, they would kill immortals. More than 30 immortals that rushed forward. In an instant, it was as if they had stepped into a pool of lightning. All disappeared in the rain. And the young king still had the leisure to talk to himself. Technical work can't reward. Chapter 1629. The Qi cultivator Xianxia and the great Zhenren Wu Lingsu did not leave the small building. Although Wu Lingsu used unorthodox methods to obtain the identity of a living immortal, Wu Lingsu had always been clear about his own abilities. He did not forget himself just because his life in Tai and city was smooth sailing. This was not because Wu Lingsu's willpower was good, but because there was that tigress at home watching over him. Every time before he could be satisfied, he would be doused with cold water. It was hard not to wake up. It must be known that the red talismans on the doors of the palace to welcome the new and greet the old all came from that woman's hand. He, Wu Lingsu, was just pretending to take out his sleeve and stick it on. At this time, when Wu Lingsu thought of the request she had made not long ago, his body couldn't help but tremble and sweat poured down his back. Did he really have to be a servant of 2 surnames? Accurately speaking, he wasn't a servant of 2 surnames. He actually had the same surname. But the struggle of the same surname in the family of the emperor, the quarrel between brothers, the degree of bloodshed was even more terrifying than the internal strife in the imperial court. If she could guarantee the continuation of the Wu family's prosperity and ensure that the only son, Wu Shizhen, could inherit the title of Minister of Yu, then it was fine. But if he did as she said, the wealth in his hands was not small, but the risk was also greater. Wu Lingsu was trembling with fear. If it was before today, he still felt that the Zhao family of Liang could stick a protective talisman on his head. The heavens were high and the emperor was far away, not to mention a vassal king far away in the northwest. But when that young man killed his way to Tai city and even directly to the imperial astronomer, great Zhenren Wu had to think carefully. Xianxia and did not look into Zhenren Wu's loss of composure. He only treated it as a fake immortal meeting a real immortal and was worried that the Wu family's position in the Liang imperial court would not be maintained. Besides, Xianxia was too busy to pay attention to a puppet of 2 generations of emperors. Xianxia raised his head and looked at the portraits on the wall. The portraits were still intact, but many of the people in the portraits had disappeared. This was a huge blow to the Qi cultivator grandmaster who wanted to become an immortal on land and then ascend before the gate of heaven closed. Since ancient times, the people who cultivated Tao believed that those who ascend would have eternal life. But if even immortals could die, then if he helped Xie Guanyin do evil, even if he ascended, could he really escape the cycle of heaven? It was easier to become an official if one had connections in the imperial court. Wasn't it the same if one wanted to become an immortal? Why did the celestial master mansion of Longhu Mountain have people ascending from generation to generation after Dafeng, while the Wudong Mountain, which was also the ancestral court, was dying? If Ancestor Lu had not entered the gate of heaven, would things have been completely different with Ancestor Lu Dongshuan's ancestral shadow? With Huang Manshan and Wang Chongluo's profound cultivation, wouldn't ascension be within reach? How could there be no immortals in the blessed land for 400 years? Compared to Wu Lingsu's fear and Xianxia's absent-mindedness, the 2 elderly Taoist priests who were responsible for offering incense all year round looked haggard. One of them leaned against a pillar, his eyes unfocused. One of them knelt on the futon devoutly, silently chanting mantras. Xie Guanyin sat lazily on the edge of the heavenly platform, his feet hanging in the air, as if he wasn't worried at all about being caught in the crossfire. In fact, whether it was hiding or escaping, if Xie Guanyin claimed to be the second in the world, no one would dare to claim to be the first in the world. Within the borders of western Shu, he had evaded Deng Tea's thousandly flying sword, which was brimming with killing intent. However, earlier in the year of Hongjia, he had evaded 2 soul-stirring pursuits. Back then, Xie Guanyin and Li Yishan were both young and vigorous God's favored sons. They hit it off immediately, especially Xie Guanyin, who was proficient in divination. He even revealed the secrets of heaven, which led to a monstrous disaster. Li Yishan was a bachelor. He only had talent but no background. Logically speaking, he should have died long ago. However, he unintentionally got close to a tree like Su Xiao and managed to escape that storm. On the other hand, Xie Feiyu, who was born in a wealthy family, was deserted by everyone and treated as an abandoned child. He was even considered a must-kill by East Sea Marshal Emperor City. Even the old lady who ascended the throne later bore a grudge against him. She didn't hesitate to let Tuoba Bodhisattva sneak into Liyang to assassinate him. Because of this, he had to change his name and hide in the imperial court. Even his own flesh and blood didn't know if he was alive or dead. Therefore, there was no more Xie Feiyu in the world who hoped to leap over the Dragon Gate. There was only Mr. Xie of Great Peace City who should be hiding behind the scenes. In the eyes of Xie Guanyin, who had watched the world's affairs with cold eyes for more than 20 years, Li Yishan and Nailan Yusi were the same type of people. Sun Ping, Zhang Julu, and Yuan Benshi were the same type of people. Huang Longshi, who had a loose tongue, was another type of person. However, in the end, Xie Guanyin felt that they were the same type of people. They worked for others, a land, a country, and the world. The only thing they weren't good at was working for themselves. If they couldn't even take care of themselves, how could they help the world? Among them, Yuan Benshi wanted to work for himself, but he couldn't. Huang Sonjia could do it, but he disdained to do it. Xie Guanying's plan was to amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. He wanted the Central Plains to sink again. Then, he would personally obtain 1,000 years of peace. If one said that Xie Guanying was seeking the status of Grand Secretary or Imperial Preceptor, or a few decades of peace and prosperity, or even ascending to become an immortal, then they were underestimating him too much. Since Huang Longshi said that there was no 100-year emperor or 1,000-year dynasty in the world, then he, Xie Guanying, would have to wrestle with this outsider who claimed to know about the future of 1,000 years. Xie Guanying suddenly felt a little lonely. The old faces and acquaintances had almost all left these years. Except for Nailan Yusi, it seemed that everyone else had died. Although there were many newcomers, in fact, except for Chen Wang, who was successful in his official career, the others still needed various polishing and scrutiny even if their futures were promising. In comparison, Su Beiji and Chen Shiliang of Bailiang stood out faster. Jean Lanting, who was not inferior to Chen Wang and was already the left assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights. Xie Guanying had never put this kind of clown in his eyes. Adding oil to the fire was never a long-term solution. It was just a flash in the pan. Between the replacement of the old and the new, Xie Guanying was not optimistic about Zhao Yuling and Yin Maochun. On the other hand, Lu Baijie, Yuan Gua, and Han Lin, the three civil officials who were either demoted or promoted to the local government, had the hope to take over the responsibilities from Qi Yonglong and Huan Wan. They were the top officials for a short time, but they were still paving the way and building bridges for Chen Wang, Yan Qi, Li Jifu, and the others. During the reign of Yong Hui, there were only two real mainstays of the Liang dynasty. There was the blue-eyed Zhang Julu and the warrior Su Xiao. It was the existence of these two people that deterred all the dragons, snakes, fish, and shrimps in the imperial court. With Zhang Julu, the literati who wanted to make achievements honestly ruled the country, and the literati who advocated quiet talk continued to talk about the wind and the moon. With Su Xiao, Chen Jibao could not leave Western Shu, Chao Chongqing could not restore the country, Yan King Zhaobing did not dare to march north with great fanfare, Gu Jiantang could only be the governor of Liao province, and Beimeng's army did not dare to march south. However, it was precisely because of the two of them, one was at the center of the imperial court, deciding the promotion of all the officials, and the other was at the northwest border, commanding 300,000 cavalrymen, that the late Emperor Zhao Dun did not dare to give the dragon throne to his son Zhao Zhuan, because there were too many thorns on the throne. The biggest knot was that as long as Su Xiao was alive, Beimeng would not dare to stake everything on a single throw to invade the Central Plains. Bailiang could substitute defense for war, allowing Liang to prosper day by day, and its national strength to gradually increase, restraining and dragging Beimeng to death. However, if they took the initiative to march north into the desert, firstly, Bailiang's chances of victory were not high, and secondly, Zhao Dun would not dare to do so. Su Xiao would not rebel, but once the northern expedition went smoothly, and Crown Prince Su Fengyan established his prestige in the northern expedition, would Su Xiao have the idea to give his son a higher position than the vassal king's throne? Even if Su Xiao would not do so, Would Su Fengnian take advantage of the situation to rebel because of the white clothes case in the capital? Even if the Su family only conquered half of Beimang, with the vast territory of the southern dynasties as strategic depth and abundant supplies, how could Liang resist the battle-hardened Beiliang cavalry? When the time came, when the wind and rain were tossed about, would the new emperor Zhao Zhuan, who did not have much prestige to speak of, really be able to rely on the eloquence of the civil officials of Taiyan City to stop Beiliang's cavalry? Taking advantage of West Chu's rebellion to weaken the vassals and suppress the power of the local generals, and at the same time taking the opportunity to demonstrate martial arts to the world on the battlefield of Guangling, was the strategy that the late emperor, Zhang Julu, Huan Wen, and Yuan Benshi had no choice but to do. In reality, they were buying time, taking advantage of the fact that Su Fengnian was not fully fledged. Even if West Chu did not rebel, Liang would still force Cao Chongqing to rise in rebellion. The imperial court had Gu Jiantang personally oversee the two Liao provinces, and Chen Jibao the vassal state of western Shu, making an aggressive stance towards Beiliang everywhere. How could a Beiliang that did not have any reinforcements not give Beimang, who had been accumulating strength for 20 years, an opportunity to exploit? A chance to take down a Beiliang that finally did not have Su Shao leading the border army? Beimang attacking Beiliang had the same meaning as Su Shao winning the Battle of the Western Wall. Although the price was huge, the results were obvious. One battle decided the fate of the country. Looking at it now, the direction of the two dynasties did not change, but there were many deviations. Even after Wu Zhongshuan left Nanjiang and joined Liang, the Guangling War did not quickly change. On the other hand, northern Liang had obtained a tragic victory. It was tragic and heroic. What was even more unexpected was that the Beiliang frontier army lost 100,000 men less than Liang had predicted. Especially the 130,000 to 140,000 cavalry, they did not suffer any major injuries. Today, they still maintained an impressive number of around 100,000 men. Originally, not only did Beiliang win a Pyrrhic victory, the Second Great Battle of Liangmang would directly spread the flames of war to Beiliang's Dao territory, or even Lingzhou. Looking at it now, Beiliang fighting to the death outside the pass was not a fool's dream. Therefore, when Su Fengnian left the vassal land without permission and Liang retreated step by step, it was not that great peace city suddenly liked to talk about comradeship and reason with people. Instead, it was because they were afraid that Beiliang would do something irreparable in a fit of anger. It was a pity that other than Tantanon, whose heart was like dead ashes, those few people of the older generation who had set the trap had all died one after another. Now the crucial point was how Grand Chancellor Qi, whom Zhao Dun had high hopes for, would react. Chapter 1630. Before his death, Zhao Zhuan had made many plans, both overtly and covertly. He had planted many foreshadowing in the officialdom, which gave Zhao Zhuan a great opportunity to display his skills after he ascended the throne. So far, it seemed that the young emperor had done a good job. Even Huan Wen, who held a grudge in his heart, was still cautious and conscientious in the new Xiangfu dynasty. There was not much of a gap between him and Qi Yanglong, and he became a mender. Unlike Su Fengnian, who could win the hearts of Beiliang's soldiers by risking his life on the battlefield, the young emperor Zhao Zhuan was like the most honorable caged bird in the world, relying only on the skin of the dragon robe. Therefore, his majesty as an emperor required years and years of hard work to build. Of course, if Zhao Zhuan could have Su Fengnian's martial cultivation, it would be a different story. For example, when Cao Chongqing and the Princess of West Chu came to deliver gifts, he defeated Cao Guanzi before Gu Jiantang and Master Lu Hao. However, in the path of martial arts, there was no such thing as a great grandmaster without risking one's life. Even Shenyuan Qingfeng, whose strength had improved by leaps and bounds, did a crazy thing like fighting to the death with Wang Xianji. Yuan Benqi's illegitimate son, Jiang Fuding, who had outstanding talent, even if he had received guidance from a large group of experts such as Gu Jiantang and Master Lu Hao, Qi Jiajie in the end, he still ended up as a tide-bearer in Donghai. Xie Guanying said softly, "Several pillars of the country can work together to support a throne room that is swaying in the wind and rain. However, a cornerstone can allow a dynasty to remain standing in the face of a once-in-a-century storm. Zhao Zhuan, Chen Wang by your side is still too young. It will take time to become someone like Zhang Julu. You can wait, but others won't." Xie Guanying closed his eyes, calm and composed. He didn't care about the immortals who walked out of the hanging statues and died like moths to a flame. Anyway, the ones who lost were the Su and Zhao families. Xie Guanying, who had personally created the situation, couldn't be more happy. If the Qi refinement warriors from the north and the south were all dead, it would be more beneficial to Xie Guaniying's long-term plan. Therefore, it would be best if Xianxia and could bow his head and listen to his orders. If he refused, Xie Guaniying would not only have the ability to escape. However, Tan Tai Pingjing accidentally dragged her family to Beiliang, so it was not easy to make a move. Now she seemed to have gone to Guangling Road alone, which was a hidden danger. As for Mount Lantua of the western regions, it no longer shunned the world with cold eyes. After Lu Songtao's death, it also put down its arrogance and chose to enter the world and rely on Beiliang. The white-robed monk Li Dongxin also went to Beiliang. Even Huyen Daguan's family of 3. Why do they all bring their families with them? Recently, there was also Duke Yenxing who left the capital without warning. It should be known that this saint had helped Zhao Shi of Liyang to persuade Chao Chongqing not long ago. Xie Guaniying, who was smiling at first, suddenly frowned. He opened his eyes and sat up, looking at the northwest. Xie Guaniying was a little annoyed. Was the reason why his vision began to blur because he had also become a part of the game? Then Xie Guaniying suddenly withdrew his gaze and looked down. As a result, he saw the seemingly innocent young Jian Zhang, the child nicknamed Little Bookcase, grinning at him. At the same high place, the young emperor Chen Wang and Lu Su on the roof of the main hall did not speak much. Only the eunuch of the ceremony directorate stood under the eaves from time to time and reported the situation at the imperial astronomer in detail with a voice that was neither soft nor loud, just enough to be heard clearly. When Zhao Zhuan heard that 2 carriages and 4 women appeared over there, the young emperor was a little self-deprecating and helpless. After that, his brother-in-law Yen Qiji went to the palace to have an audience. It was also an indispensable and important step for Yen Qiji to rush to the palace to pass a message to Su Fengnian. But when Yen Qiji hurried back and knelt under the eaves, the young emperor was obviously a little angry. Even the seal eunuch Song Tonglu was a little nervous. Song Tonglu knew that other than Yen Qiji's identity as a relative of the imperial family, he was also a very special balance. As for the balance in the previous emperor's heart, one of them was the scholar Yen Jieshi. This dual leader of Beiliang's literary and officialdom had betrayed Beiliang and entered the court. Naturally, the previous emperor was very happy and favored the entire Yen family. Yen Jieshi was made one of the 6 palace scholars, and his daughter Yen Donggu was now the empress. In reality, Jean Lanting was also the same, so his meteoric rise shocked the entire capital. Yao Baifeng was also the same, but this great scholar of Confucianism had leaned toward Beiliang and Su Shao many times in court. Thus, he was still an imperial college chancellor with high hopes but no real power. As an old acquaintance of Zhang Lu, Yuan Gua was even more pitiful. He had finally come back and become the Minister of Rights. Because he stood on the wrong side of the issues of the transport of grain and the printing of documents, he was quickly sent packing out of Great Peace City. As a scholar, it was important to have strength of character. As a civil official, it was not as important to have strength of character as the scholars imagined. The difference of one word was like the difference between heaven and earth. The emperor and the young master of the Yellow Gate, both of whom had good reputations, were in a deadlock, one high, one low, one sitting, one kneeling. Chen Wang smiled and stood. The young emperor seemed to say in a fit of pique to ignore him, but Chen Wang still walked down the ladder to the ground. He helped Yen Qiji up but did not help him up. Chen Wang did not force him. He stood at the feet of this rising star of the Hanlin Academy. Looking at the tightly closed palace doors, he said softly, "Stand up. The more you kneel, the more useless it is. You cannot sink too deeply into the matter of figuring out the emperor's heart, but you cannot do nothing. You are not an official that seeks fame to seek favor. Of course, Yen Qiji does not need it. In reality, you can't do it. Since this is the case, rather than have the emperor vent his anger on the king of Beiliang, you might as well stand up and shamelessly follow me to the roof. Just think of it as looking at the scenery. At the very least, you will make the bad thing worse, right?" Yen Qiji lowered his head and knelt without saying a word. Chen Wang, who had always been gentle and respectful, suddenly lowered his voice and said sternly, "What, are you not afraid of implicating your father and sister? Or is it that your Yen family has more descendants than the dazzling Jiangnan Lu family? Without you, Yen Qiji, you can easily bring out a few more? If you really have the ability, then bring the empress and scholar Yen here to kneel. When the time comes, I, Chen Wang, will kneel with you. Everyone can join in the fun. How about that?" Xianxia's shoulders trembled. He no longer cried silently, but sobbed silently. Chen Wang sighed and said softly, I, Chen Wang, am not like you. I am just a poor scholar studying hard. I have some classmates in my hometown, some in the same year as the imperial examination, and some colleagues in the officialdom. But there are very few who can truly be called friends. It can even be said that there is not one. So, I do not agree with you kneeling to beg the emperor for mercy, but I can somewhat understand. You and I are now rich, powerful and famous. It's actually very simple. Chen Wang glanced out of the corner of his eye at the eunuch in embroidered robes standing silently with his hands behind his back. The latter did not move. Chen Wang hesitated and then squatted down next to Xianxia. He said lightly, The old King Liang has the strongest army in the world, hundreds of thousands of cavalry. From the northwest border to Great Peace City, it is not as far as we think. But every time the general enters the capital, he only has a few personal retainers with him. Of these two matters, which do you think is more difficult? For normal people, it is the former, but for the general, it is the latter. When a general has a large army, and a civil official has the power of the court, what is difficult is not to be spirited like normal people think, but to not act recklessly. Instead, to weigh each of the 5 words, loyalty, filial piety, benevolence, righteousness, and affection. Chen Wang smiled. The new King Liang, Su Fengnian, your good brother, has also weighed these 5 words these years. As an official, speak of loyalty. As a son, speak of filial piety. As a general, speak of benevolence. As a brother, speak of righteousness. As a husband, speak of affection. In my view, his entry into the capital this time was unexpected but reasonable. He put aside the word of loyalty and picked up the word of filial piety. In reality, I am slightly disappointed that he would abandon the country for his own selfish interests. But I also know that this is my inhumane request. It is my wishful thinking to place Su Fengnian in the position of a saint. In reality, it is the exact opposite. I knew long ago that Su Fengnian was never a saint. In the end, he is a man of the Jianghu, and is more suited to the Jianghu. In the high court, he is a young vassal king with grievances that are difficult to resolve. But in the distant Jianghu, he can become a hero that does not lose to Li Chungang. He chose to leave the Jianghu, and take on a heavy responsibility to stand outside the Beiliang border. He did not have any freedom, and only people died. I think that Su Fengnian is already very unhappy. And, in short, he is unhappy. It is a very simple principle, but many people do not understand it. If someone says Su Fengnian, he should be satisfied. But I, Chen Wang, am a poor scholar at the bottom of the marketplace. Step by step, I have reached my current position. But there are some things that I am also very unhappy about. You can't say that it is easy for me to stand and talk, right? You can't. If anyone says that and I hear it, I will one day make them even more unhappy. See, I am also not a saint. This has nothing to do with whether or not I am an official of the left scattered cavalry or not. None of us are saints. So, His Majesty is also not a saint. There is justice in heaven and earth, and people also have human nature. It is not wrong to follow this principle and conduct oneself in the world. So, because Su Fengnian is Su Zhao's son, it is not wrong for him to come to the capital and go to the imperial astronomer. Because His Majesty is the son of the previous emperor, it is difficult for him to back down. It is also not wrong for him to be unwilling to back down. Since that is the case, you, Xianxia, have already knelt. His Majesty and I both understand your principles. Why do you want to take a mile after taking an inch? Even the ignorant children in the capital know that kneeling in the imperial court is a simple matter. Being able to stand is difficult. Why don't I take a look and see if there is gold or silver on the ground? Chapter 1631. Xianxia finally wiped his tears and stood up. When Xianxia was about to bow and express his gratitude, Chen Wang shook his head and said, Forget it, forget it. Lu Su has already done the same thing in front of His Majesty today. If you do it again, where will His Majesty put his face? Once the label of forming a clique for personal gain is put on me, I can forget about continuing to be promoted. Xianxia said calmly, Gentlemen are a group, not a clique. Chen Wang was stunned for a moment. Then he turned around and began to climb the ladder. He muttered softly, What a waste of my effort. That's good. I don't have to waste money to treat you to a drink. Yan Qiji, who had flattered the wrong person, was immediately embarrassed. Song Tonglu, who had been ignoring their conversation, secretly raised the corner of his mouth. On the roof of the main hall, Chen Wang, who was originally sitting next to the young emperor, moved his seat. Yan Qiji could only bite the bullet and sit between the emperor and Chen Wang. Zhao Zhuan said coldly, "Aren't you going to learn from those famous officials who remonstrated with the emperor?" Yan Qiji lowered his head and his expression couldn't be seen clearly. He said softly, "Sir Chen is right, as an official, one has to think about being promoted. This is human nature." Chen Wang, who was immediately retorted, didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Scholars were not good people. On the other side, blind Lu Su smiled playfully. Zhao Zhuan was a little self-deprecating. He sighed and said, "You're right, you and Su Fengnian are good brothers who grew up together. That's why you're kneeling and pleading for him today. If you, Yan Qiji, were only an official of Liang, I, as the emperor, might be angry on the surface and even throw you into the cold bench for a few years. However, deep down, I'm not angry. If I say that I'm not angry at all, I'd be lying. However, you're not only Su Fengnian's friend. I'm also not only the emperor of Liang. You and I are not only monarch and minister, but also family. In the future, I might choose more concubines and there will be more than one. At that time, there will be more imperial fathers-in-law and imperial uncles. However, I'm not lying to you, you're first the fourth prince's brother-in-law, then the imperial uncle of the current emperor." Yan Qiji was stunned. Zhao Zhuan put his arm around Yan Qiji's shoulder and laughed. He pointed into the distance. "Look! The wind and clouds were surging. I hope that one day, the four of us will be able to sit here together and enjoy the scenery." Chen Wang's expression was solemn as he sat upright. Blind Lu Su raised his eyes and looked into the distance, his hands casually supporting himself on the roof. Great Peace City was the most virtuous city. There were many people, and naturally there were many rules. Even the residences of the officials were divided into 3, 6, and 9 levels. They were mostly divided into the rich and powerful. For example, the group of residences where the Duke of Yan and the Marquis of Huayang resided were mostly of great birth. Dukes, marquises, and counts were piled together. For a new face like Chen Wang, if he had not relied on his relationship with the Jun Wang to become a son-in-law, even if Chen Wang had become a regular attendant of the scattered cavalry of the province, he would not have been able to get a residence there. Most of the people in Jing came from the Hanlin Academy, the Imperial College, and the Imperial Censorate. They were officials of Liang, and also scholars that were renowned in the scholarly circles. Living next to each other saved them the effort of calling for friends. In Great Peace City, there were also poor officials. For example, the earliest Ministry of Rights was a typical government office. Many of the officials of the Ministry of Rights who did not have a high rank and were not the top officials even had to rely on money to survive. They passed their days in poverty. They were called clean sleeves, and their bitterness was not known to outsiders. The rich people like Song Tianbao, who was brothers with the son of the former Minister of Revenue, Wang Yuanran, and the grandson of the old General Yan Zhenchuan, Yan Tongshu. Even though he had a rich father, it was still very awkward for him to buy a residence in Great Peace City. The residences of the dukes, marquises, and counts were people that he could not get in. There was no point in going to the residences of the poor officials. The feeling of being looked down upon all day was not good. Fortunately, there was another choice. That was to buy a large residence in the middle of the residences of the officials with power and the rich. During the day, he would go to the residences of the officials in Jing and pretend to be their sons and grandsons. At night, he would make up for it from people who had money but had less money than him. Some busybodies had studied the group of officials in Jing who had made a name for themselves at the end of Yonghui. They had probably made a name for themselves in the poor area to the south of Great Peace City where scholars gathered. Then they quickly rose to the ranks of the nobility in the northeast of the city. In the end, they went to the east to buy a grand residence. If one day they could move to the west of Jing like Chen Wang and Chen Xiaobao, then their lives would be complete. Not only would they not have any regrets, they would also be able to answer to their ancestors and descendants. With the Peng family at the head, the large and small landowning clans in the north suddenly flooded into the northeast of Great Peace City in the second year of the auspicious talisman. As a result, the residences in this area, which were already worth an inch of gold, became even more in demand. This caused many mid-level officials who had saved up some silver with great difficulty and wanted to finally be able to no longer rent houses to live their days, to the point that they couldn't help but curse the Liaodong barbarians in private, saying that other than being rich, they weren't anything good at all. As the most important old power in the northeast of the capital, the officials of the 6 ministries of the Xianxia province didn't have a good attitude toward this either. Their relationship with the new landowning households that moved in was rather estranged. This was also very normal. In the past 20 years, especially after the old Grand Secretary by Yan personally presided over the imperial examinations, Liang no longer deliberately supported the scholars of the northern lands in the imperial examinations. As a result, in the previous examinations, the scholars of the southern lands occupied at least 70% of the seats with an overwhelming advantage, forming an extremely clear structure of northern generals and southern ministers. However, in the 10 years after Yong Hui's death before the auspicious talisman, there was no war in the world. Where did the new generals come from? Naturally, there were more and more southern officials in the imperial court. The Green Party, which was known for its unity, was one of the most striking examples. As the great generals of the 4 campaigns for equalities and 4 towns, who were mostly from the north, died of old age, the northeast of Great Peace City became less and less a place for the northern scholars to speak with their backs straight. If it wasn't for the fact that there was still General of the North, Ma Lulong, left to hold up the facade, and the officials from the south didn't kill him to the last one, the northern officials would have been pushed aside to the point of wanting to die. Thus, the first thing the Peng family did after buying a new residence was to grandly pay a visit to the manor of General of the North. Although it was said that they didn't even see the sickly Ma Lulong, after all, they were personally received by the eldest son of the Ma family, General of Andong, Ma Zhongxian. With the Peng family leading the way, the collective migration of the 2 wealthy families of Liao was quite smooth. The Minister of War, Liu Baijie, had left the capital, and the backbone of the Green Party, Hong Lingshu, had entered the capital. It looked like the Jiangnan powers had entered and left the imperial court without any losses, but in reality, it was clear that they had greatly damaged their vitality. Thus, the large-scale movement of the northern scholars into the capital was very interesting. The doors of the official mansions were higher than the street level. This was a rule that had been followed for hundreds of years. The so-called steps in the officialdom were actually the steps in front of the door. The number of steps was very particular. According to the laws of Liang, first, one had to be of the flowing class. Only then could the number of steps be determined by the rank of an official. A 6th-level official could only build 3 steps, and a 4th-level official could build 4 steps. This meant that this was the case for local governors and ordinary generals with real power. Next, most of the assistant ministers of the 6 ministries, if not specially bestowed, could only build 5 steps. The ministers of the 6 ministries had 6 steps, and very few could build 7 steps. For example, the former Minister of Personnel, Zhao Yuling, and the current Minister of Rights, Sima Puhua, had also received this honor. It was said that on the day the Sima family mobilized a large number of people to build more steps for their mansions, the old minister cried on the spot. What was interesting was that the rare 7 steps in the northeast were rare in the area where Chen Xiaobao and Chen Wang lived. If you didn't have 6 steps, you wouldn't have the face to greet people when you left the house. 7 steps were also very common. Chen Wang's father-in-law was at the 7th step. Even someone like Duke Yan, Gao Shizhi, who was at the 8th step, was not rare. However, all of the officials in the capital knew that the steps in the west of the city were all fake. They relied on the ancestral shadow and the surname of the Zhao family to decorate the face of the court. However, the steps in the northeast were truly exchanged for by the official hats of the 2 recent generations. The saying, West 7 is not as rare as North 5, was precisely the reason. In the northeast of the capital, there was another saying, Ma 8, Yen 7, Minister 6. It said that most of the official mansions here were only at the 6th step, but the Yen manor was at the 7th step. The Ma manor had the same standard of 8 steps as the vassal states and dukes. Recently, not only did the eldest son of the Ma family, Ma Zhongxian, often rush back to the manor in the inner city from the Jingji East Army, even the eldest grandson, who often didn't return home at night and smelled of cosmetics, stayed at home obediently and declined visitors. It was probably because they had heard too many rumors of the Ma family's old master finally dying. In the end, he was still able to do it every time. As for the strange behavior of Ma Zhongxian and his son, not many people took it seriously. However, whether it was the son, Ma Zhongxian, or the grandson, Ma Wenho, they all knew that the old master might not be able to make it this time. This was because the old master, who had been bedridden for many years, was not only no longer muddle-headed, but also had a sense of vitality. He could even sit up and eat a few mouthfuls of plain porridge. His eyes were much clearer. This was called the final radiance of the setting sun. Some old people knew that they were nearing the end of their lifespan, so they didn't mind letting the wind extinguish the last bit of their candle flame. When the old master of the Ma family heard from his son, Ma Zhongxian, that Bai Liang had defeated Bai Mang, he only opened his turbid eyes and asked shakily, "How many died?" Ma Zhongxian truthfully reported the general situation of the battle, which was still very vague. However, compared to the officials of the Ministry of War, he was already closer to the truth. Chapter 1632. The first time the old man sat up was when he heard that the young king had entered the capital without permission. However, the old man was probably too tired and soon lay back down. Only when he heard that the 800 Bailiang light cavalry scared the Jingji Western army out of their wits did the old man call for his grandson, who was widely acknowledged to be useless, to return to the mansion. Ma Wenho was a strange person in Great Peace City. He was said to be a playboy and did not play well with people like Wang Yuanran and Yen Tongshu since childhood. However, he was said to be ambitious, but he never got along well with people like Yin Chongying and Han Xingyan. Therefore, Ma Wenho and the old Grand Secretary Zhang Julu's youngest son, Zhang Bianguan, who lived in a shabby alley and liked to wander around the city, were called the strange people in the capital. However, compared to the eccentric Zhang Bianguan, Ma Wenho was actually quite popular. When he was young, he traveled and studied and left home for more than 2 years. He went to Donghai Martial Emperor City, Nanjiang Mountains, Shishu Nanzhao, Qingzhou Xiangfan, and the north of Jizhou. Ma Wenho was personally brought back to the Ma mansion by his father, Ma Zhongxian, that very night. The old general of the north, Ma Lulong, sat up for the second time with the help of his grandson, Ma Wenho. After that, whether it was eating or listening to Ma Wenho's reading, the old man sat up more than he lay down. After that, whether it was when he heard that the Baimang general, Yang Yuanzan, died at the mouth of Gourd in Yuzhou, or when he heard that the 2 Liao cavalry under Gu Jiantang finally could not hold back and showed signs of restlessness, the old man, who had been in the officialdom for more than 60 years, appeared to be calm. However, when the old man personally handed over the tiger tally, he sighed with emotion, seeking death. It was unknown whether he was talking about the young king or someone else. Today, the old man seemed to want to go to the morning court, but until his body could no longer bear the bumpy ride, he did not make it difficult for his children and grandchildren. Under Ma Zhongxian's secret instructions, several hidden Ma family consecrators spread out like a net. They only had one thing to do, which was to keep an eye on the young man surnamed Su from afar. Soon, news came back to the Ma mansion one after another. The young vassal king left the Damayai post house, but he didn't attend the court meeting. Instead, he went to the old Ministry of War Yamen in Liang without entering. Entering the Ministry of Rights Yamen, Minister Sima Puhua slipped away. Finally, he arrived at the Imperial Observatory and met with the Empress Dowager Zhao Ji and Jiujiu Restaurant's lady boss. The old man would comment on each piece of news he heard. The old man was full of energy and became very talkative. His mind was very meticulous, as if he wanted to say all the words that he had accumulated in his stomach for the past 10 years in one go. The old Yamen of the Ministry of War is actually a place with good feng shui. It's a pity that it's been abandoned. Wenho, my Ma family has been a force in Liang for a long time. It's just that we changed our sails quickly back then. In fact, when I was first thrown into the Ministry of War by your great-grandfather, I was only 18 years old. Many people thought that your great-grandfather was muddle-headed, leaving the only son of his family in the capital. Did he really not want the foundation of his ancestors? Then, after more than 20 years, I finally became the right assistant minister of the Ministry of War. Everyone shut up. Some people were dead and couldn't open their mouths. Some people lost their power and didn't have the face to complain in front of me. I've been in the Ministry of War and the military all my life, but people of the blue-eyed Tantanon's generation all know that I've never been on the battlefield in my life, let alone killed anyone. Isn't it funny? Such a person ended up as the great general of the North? When I became the big boss of the Ministry of War, I saw many young generals. They were ambitious, capable, and murderous. At that time, there was a Jinzhou barbarian surnamed Su who struggled to climb up the ranks of the bureaucracy. He was always defeated. There were several times when he lost all his troops and horses and almost became a lone army. No one was optimistic about him. I wasn't optimistic either. Without a foundation, he could only rely on his life. Wenho, you have to understand that the Liang of that time wasn't as peaceful as it is now. There were endless battles. Now, killing 100 Beimang barbarians was enough to make you a commandant. At that time, it was possible for you to kill over 1,000 Dongyue or Northern Han soldiers and still not be able to become a commandant. Otherwise, if you managed to become a commandant with great difficulty, it would become someone else's military achievement the next day. As a result, there was one time when that young man ran to the yamen with his head covered in dirt and face covered in dirt, asking for troops, horses, and provisions from us old fellows of the Ministry of War. No one was willing to pay him any attention, as they felt that he wouldn't be able to make back his capital. In reality, the Ministry of War only had a dozen or so tiger tally that could be used. Otherwise, they would have to mobilize private armies that couldn't see the light of day. If I remember correctly, that day, it was raining. That young man from Jianghu, who only had the empty title of commandant, was standing in the courtyard with a chest of silver at his feet. His back was straight, and one could tell at a glance that he wasn't someone who would ask for help. Just that bit of silver? Did he think that the Ministry of War would transfer 700 to 800 men to him? Although everyone knew that this person wasn't greedy for money and that as long as he won a battle, no matter how many of his men died, the first thing he would do would be to give the money to the officials of the Ministry of War. But of all things, this fellow shouldn't have killed a junior sent to his army by the Ministry of War when he lost a battle. That's why no one was willing to pay him any attention. I've seen people who don't care about their lives in battle, but none of them are as reckless as him. He's always at the forefront of every battle. Who would dare to fully support such a person? If he only knows how to fight and doesn't know how to be an official, he might have died that day. How could that be? But I was in a good mood that day because that Ministry of War senior doctor always liked to go against me. My idea was very simple: to discuss that Ministry of War's senior doctor. So I walked up to that young man who I had never dealt with directly before, and agreed to give him a troop of soldiers. Hearing this, Ma Wenho curiously asked, "Did you win a huge victory very quickly?" The old man smiled and shook his head. "We did win, and 3 times in a row at that. But the troops were all wiped out by that young man. Of course, I definitely earned back my capital. At that time, human life was the most worthless thing in the world, but once a strong young man put on armor and picked up a sword or spear, he could still be counted by the head. The Ma family's current foundation was accumulated bit by bit at that time. Many of the generals who originally ruled over a region also spent all their resources bit by bit at that time." Ma Wenho was speechless. Most of the young people of his generation didn't like to listen to the older generations nagging about the wars of the spring and autumn period. They had heard so much since they were young that their ears had grown calluses. Ma Wenho was no exception. The old man sighed emotionally. "You must have guessed that the Jianghu commandant who needed to listen to your grandfather's mood and expression was Su Xiao. Later on, he was the butcher of Liang, and finally, the king of Beiliang." Ma Wenho nodded lightly. The old man had never mentioned this matter to anyone before. Chapter 1633. As the old saying goes, those who are unjust are doomed to destruction. That's not entirely true. No matter what, Su Xiao being able to die of old age in bed with a body full of injuries is probably God's reward for his righteousness. But those who are unjust will bring disaster to their descendants, I believe very much. The Su family is a good example. Su Xiao killed so many people. Look at his children. Which one of them is blessed? The eldest daughter died a long time ago, the second daughter is paralyzed in a wheelchair, and the youngest is an idiot. As for the eldest son, this young man, I think he hasn't had a good time these years. On the surface, he looks impressive, but that's just it. Humans were very strange. The poor would think that the rich would definitely lead a good life, while the poor would think that those with great power would definitely do whatever they wanted. They were half right and half wrong. Let's make a simple comparison. If an ordinary person was kicked on the street for no reason, they might curse and be angry for a few days before crossing the threshold. But what if it was you, Ma Wenho? If you slap Yin Maochuan's son or Gu Jiantong's son, will you forget this thorn tomorrow or next year? You won't. This kind of unhappiness is more or less the same as a poor person who loses a dozen taels of silver and wants to die. Ma Wenho muttered softly, "Yin Chongqing and old Gu's son dared to slap me? Won't I break their 3 legs?" Ma Zhongxian glared at him. How old are you? Do you know the severity of the situation? 30 years old, 30 years old. What nonsense are you standing for? The old man waved his hand, indicating that Ma Zhongxian shouldn't be angry. Zhongxian, don't be fooled by your son's mouth. Actually, Yen, is very bad. Don't think that teaching Yin and Gu's children a lesson is wrong. Is it wrong? No, as long as the method is appropriate, it's actually a good thing. In terms of understanding, you, Ma Zhongxian, are thousands of miles away from your son. Ma Zhongxian made a sound of acknowledgement. Although this Andong general was famous in the capital for being unruly, he was extremely filial. He listened to everything Ma Lulong said and never felt that his wings had hardened or that Ma Lulong had become muddle-headed. The old man, who was so thin that he was only skin and bones, smiled happily. He reached out his trembling hand and gently squeezed his son's shoulder. You are stronger than me. You have fought in real battles and made great contributions. Your personality is also pure. This is a great thing. You are the most suitable person to keep what you have achieved. Especially at the foot of the emperor. You have shouldered the burden of the Ma family. The old man turned his head and stared at Ma Wenho, who had been doing nothing for more than 10 years. It's the responsibility of your grandfather and your great-grandfather's generations to fight for the country. It's your father's responsibility to protect the family business. So, it's your turn to revive the family or to take it to the next level. Marvin kept his mouth shut, not saying anything. Seeing his son's sickly appearance, Ma Zhongxian immediately felt a surge of anger. Just as he was about to flip out, he was glared at by the old man and immediately kept quiet out of fear. The old man said softly, Wenho, your father is my only son, but I have 4 grandsons and 2 granddaughters. All these years, your 3 younger brothers have been busy fighting for power and favor. You're the only one who's been carefully protecting your 2 younger sisters. This is very good. Those 3 good-for-nothings don't have any real ability, but their ability to fight for favor is very good. They are even more sissy than women. If you give the family business to them, it will take at most a generation. They will squander all the gold and silver mountains. The old man emphasized and repeated, You are very good. Ma Zhongxian stared blankly. The old man curled his lips and sneered, There are 2 kinds of people in this world that you can't deal with. One is a perfect person who is close to being a sage. For example, blue eyes. No matter what you do, it is very difficult to have a personal relationship with them. The other kind is people who have no bottom line. They are not afraid of people's bottom line. After all, you know what kind of person they are. Be careful. In the end, those who could avoid disaster and seek benefits were the only ones who did not have a bottom line. You never knew when they would bring you a surprise. Such people were like the previous heavenly official Zhao Yuling and the current left assistant minister of rights Jean Lanting. If you have a deep relationship with them, sooner or later, they will sell you out. You will feel wronged, but they will be smug. If the Ma family is a small family that needs to climb up the social ladder, it is a different matter. It is good enough to enter their eyes. But while the Ma family is not one of the wealthiest families in Great P City, they are barely in the top 10. Then you can ignore these people. Don't get close to either kind of people. Speaking to hear, the old man gave a piece of advice to his son and grandson. Zhongxian, don't think about making great achievements all day. Especially don't think about going to Guangling Path to join in the fun. Remember, as the ruler of a country, he doesn't necessarily want someone to die. Did the previous emperor really not want to go down in history with Zhang Julu, Yan Zhenchuan, and the others? At that time, if the emperor wants you dead, as a subject, who can you reason with? So, do not make great achievements for the country, but you must make small contributions to the ruler. Remember. Wenho, I'll give you some words. Tantanon told me a long time ago, the water flows slowly when the water is deep, and the people speak slowly when they are important. You don't say those grand words. I don't hate that I didn't see the ancients, I only hate that the ancients didn't see me. In life, I will be made a marquis, and when I die, I will go to the temple to accompany the sacrifice. It sounds very satisfying, but compared to Tantanon's words, it is a dozen streets away. Some words should be kept in the stomach and should not be said. A man's ambition is not as obvious as a woman's after a few months of pregnancy. Ma Wenho chuckled. I don't like to talk about these things now. In the past, I was thinking that if one day I really made a name for myself, I would be able to write history books and use it directly. The old man laughed and scolded, "Brat." Ma Zhongxian felt a little wronged and said gloomily, "Father, why are you scolding me too?" The old man squeezed out a smile and reached out again to pat Ma Zhongxian's head. "You're also a brat. All right, I've scolded all three of you." Ma Zhongxian laughed, but there were already some tears in this rough man's eyes. Ma Wenho kept one hand on his grandfather's arm and the other on the old man's back. At this time, an expert of the Ma family close to 70 years old appeared at the door, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Su Fengnian has already killed more than 30 immortals at the gate of the Imperial Astronomer. The 1,200 heavy cavalry has not yet entered the battlefield." The general of the north, Ma Lulong, was somewhat absent-minded. Then the old man suddenly said sternly, "Zhongxian, quickly enter the palace and meet the emperor. Even if you break your knees, you must stop His Majesty from using the heavy cavalry." Ma Zhongxian subconsciously stood up, but when he realized that the old man did not have long to live, he hesitated. The old man angrily rebuked, "Idiot, I'm using the entire Ma family's face as a ladder for His Majesty to walk down from his high position. His Majesty can appoint anyone to be the commander of the heavy cavalry, but only you, Ma Zhongxian, cannot. Only in this way can one hope to enter the center of power as quickly as possible." Ma Zhongxian wiped his eyes and left with large strides. Ma Lulong was panting heavily while Ma Wenho gently patted the old man's back. The old man smiled wryly. "Let me lie down. If I can't hold on, there's no need to hold on." Ma Wenho carefully let the old man lie down. The old man held his grandson's hand and laughed softly. "It's rare to live in the 70s. Grandpa is already in his 80s. What do you have to be sad about?" Ma Wenho squeezed out a smile and said in a choked voice, "It's not that I despise my father for being stupid. Even if he curses, he won't hit the point. Grandpa has great wisdom. Even if he doesn't curse, I can still listen." The old man lay there quietly, already in a bleak state of breathing less than he breathed out. The old man calmly said, "Wenho, you're 70 and do as you please, not overstepping the rules. This saying is very interesting. Grandpa really believed it after 70. If you don't believe it, then you must live to this age. Your heart isn't calm enough. You need to study more. In the dead of night, you can go sit on those 8 steps more often." Ma Wenho grabbed the old man's hand and nodded vigorously. Ma Lulong slowly closed his eyes. "I was born earlier than you, Su Xiao, and I died later than you, Su Xiao. I've finally won a round against you." When the old man finished speaking, he finally passed away. Now, it's time for me to die. Chapter 1634. In the blink of an eye, this rain of swords from the bottom to the top had killed more than 30 immortals who had been invited by Liang to step down from the altar. However, the sword formation near the Imperial Astronomer was still rapidly rising into the sky. Each sword was like a raindrop. The densely packed tips of the swords pointed at the Imperial Astronomer at the same time. The Imperial Astronomer had unknowingly turned into a cage to trap beasts. The civil officials of the Imperial Court who were condemned by thousands of people would probably die without any illness. The generals on the battlefield would most likely become hedgehogs when faced with thousands of arrows. In short, they would not have a good ending. Now that the thousands of swords were hovering, ready to strike, the immortals who were pointed at by countless swords would not feel good. On a high wall about a mile away from the Imperial Astronomer, 2 spectators sat swaggering. One of them was dressed in snow-white clothes and the other in a bright red robe. The man in white sat on the wall with one leg bent and the other leg hanging on the wall. A wine pot was tied to his wrist with a red string. He raised his head and drank a mouthful of wine. Then he laughed softly and said, "Peach Blossom Sword God, does this move look like the way I welcomed guests in the heavy rain at the gate of Dunhuang City?" Dong Tai, who had been called out, finally appeared. He stood not far away from the white-robed Luo Yang and nodded. "It does, but the momentum is bigger than yours." The former #1 devil of Bei Mang, or the current leader of Zhulu Mountain, Luo Yang, stared at the battlefield in the distance that could be said to be unprecedented. She pondered and said, "After being a lonely soul for 800 years, I have seen many ascended immortals and banished immortals. I know a little about the ways inside. More than 60 grandmasters of Longhu Mountain descended to the mortal world together. Due to the restrictions of the heavenly Tao, most of them are no more than Vajra realm physique and finger mystery realm qi. At most, they have mastered a few greatly reduced Xuannong of the immortals. They only look like immortals on the earth. They are like paper tigers. They can scare people, but they can't kill people. However, the 7 or 8 of them standing in the middle, even if their cultivation has been reduced, are at least in the celestial state. They can't be underestimated, especially the 3 immortals in the middle. They are all Taoist saints, aren't they? Dong Tai placed one hand on his chest and rubbed his chin with the other. The one with the sword is the first grandmaster of Longhu Mountain. The one with the lotus on his head should be the first immortal of Liang dynasty. It is said that the purple golden lotus pond in the Taoist mansion was created by him. And the one riding of the white deer is Qi Xuanzhen's uncle. They are all well-known figures. If they were about to ascend but had not yet entered the celestial gate, they would be powerful. They would be real divine transcendents. But now, they are just ordinary earthly immortals. They lose because their bodies are not strong enough, but they win because they understand the way of heaven. Well, since they are in the human world now, especially when they are facing that guy, this is not an advantage. Suddenly, a man in a green robe appeared leisurely. In terms of bearing and demeanor, the peach blossom sword god was thousands of miles away from this one. Even if the latter had white hair on his temples, when he stood next to Dong Tai, one looked like a country bumpkin while the other was a famous scholar. Comparisons were odious. It was no wonder that Dong Tai's disciple wanted his master, who was not good at appearance, to recite poems every time he rode a donkey. The green-robed Confucian paid attention to the movements at the imperial astronomer's side. He sighed and said, Dong Tai Luoyang, facing more than 61st grade realm cultivators, including 3 saints, how would you feel if you were in their shoes? Dong Tai thought for a moment, then said seriously, if we kill until our hands are tired, we might need to switch swords a few times, and we won't be able to kill them all. Luoyang smiled and said, it's not easy to kill, and it's not easy to escape. For some reason, Chao Chongqing, who still had not left the capital to return to Guangling, looked a little helpless. Luoyang seemed to ask casually, Dong Tai, after Li Chungang borrowed your sword, will there be a day when you can truly wield a sword? Dong Tai said indifferently, even if there is a day, it won't be today. My friendship with that guy is long gone. Don't expect me to interfere this time. Chao Chongqing said in a low voice, it's starting. A giant semicircle enveloped the imperial astronomer's sword formation. Tens of thousands of swords shot out simultaneously. The deer-riding immortal lightly pulled on the reins, and the white deer beneath him took a light step forward. The white deer's hoof stomped down, and like a boulder thrown into a small lake, a vast ripple instantly spread out. It was like hearing the sounds of nature. The flying sword's momentum instantly froze, but the flying swords were too fast and fierce. They only paused for a moment before continuing to charge forward. The white deer's second hoof stomped heavily on the ground, and the majestic chi once again spread out. The flying swords were once again slightly slowed. Using the earth as a bell, each time the white deer stepped forward, the immortal's voice would violently strike the bell. When the white deer was 30 steps away from the gates of the imperial astronomer, the flying swords that covered the sky like a swarm of locusts had already begun to slow down from their rapid flight. The 1,000-odd heavy cavalry on both sides of the street raised their blades to meet the enemy. The dense mass of flying swords pressed down, suffocating. Although their speed had greatly decreased, they still continued to descend with a momentum that could be slowed down but could not be stopped. As the saying goes, gods are 3 feet above one's head. Now, there were flying swords 3 feet above. Several cavalry did not believe this, and were even more unwilling to wait for death. They jumped high from their horses and slashed at the flying swords. The war blades were like knives cutting through water. They seemed to easily cut through the water, and the flying swords were unharmed. However, the flying swords that had been slashed by the cavalry's war blades were the first to leave the sword formation, and disappeared in a flash. In the next moment, 6 cavalry seemed to have been pierced through by a crossbow, and were nailed to the ground from the air. There were no tangible flying swords on their corpses, but a fist-sized bloody hole appeared on each of their bodies. They were seeking their own deaths. A cavalry commander saw that the situation was not good and angrily shouted, "Dismount!" Without military orders, no one is allowed to draw their blades. The heavy cavalry dismounted, and did their best to distance themselves from the flying swords. Chapter 1635. The immortal riding on the white deer waved his sleeves casually, and a purple gold lotus bud bloomed above the heads of the Ma clan's heavy cavalry and the Li clan's armored soldiers. It grew rapidly, swaying even though there was no wind. It was like two armies facing each other on the battlefield. Neither side dared to act rashly. The flying swords finally stopped moving and hovered in the air. The immortal raised a hand at the same time and made a grabbing motion in the air. He shouted softly, "5 mountains, hear my command." A towering mountain rose from under Su Fengnian's feet, lifting him up high. Around him, 4 immortal mountains with different auras rose slowly, each with its own majesty and danger. Su Fengnian took off the cold blade in its scabbard and used it to support himself on the ground. He placed both hands on the hilt and pressed it down gently. Not only did he stop the rising of the mountain under his feet, but the surrounding mountains also began to tremble. Bailiang's sharp edge did not move for the wind and thunder, nor did it retreat for rain and snow. On the vast territory of Liang, the 5 towering mountains stood tall on the land of the Central Plains. All the Taoist temples built on the mountains, regardless of size, extinguished the incense in the incense burners, regardless of whether they were inside or outside the houses. Moreover, the previously lit smoke began to swirl and sway. At the same time, 4 immortals flew out from the gate of the imperial astronomer. They stood on the peaks of the 4 mountains and each took out a seal made of wood, copper, jade, and gold. The seal buttons were respectively azure dragon, white tiger, vermilion bird, and black tortoise. Su Fengnian glanced at the immortal standing proudly on the peak of West Mountain with a strange expression. It was just a casual glance, but the immortal, the seal, and the mountain all turned into powder. The old Taoist with the lotus crown, who had been watching with folded arms, looked up at the western sky. He seemed to have mixed feelings and sighed. Su Fengnian took advantage of the victory and pressed down hard on the hilt of his blade. The scene was like the Central Plains sinks, that the seed of Liang had been muttering to himself for 20 years. After the rainbow light that symbolized the immortal of West Mountain's cultivation exploded, the immortals of the other 3 mountains collapsed. Su Fengnian slowly landed on the ground. When the tip of the cold blade scabbard touched the ground, at the top of the 5 Peaks mountain, regardless of whether it was cloudy or sunny, a thunderclap rang out at the same time. This was what it meant when immortals fought, and mortals suffered. The flying swords in the imperial astronomer's sky that had been stationary suddenly accelerated. The deer-riding immortal snorted coldly and pulled on the reins. The white deer, which was shrouded in immortal energy, raised its front leg high and stomped on the ground. The countless flying swords once again stopped in their tracks, but this time, the swords trembled violently and buzzed. The purple-gold lotus flower that had been protecting everyone was withering at a speed visible to the naked eye. All the soldiers subconsciously shrunk their necks, their faces covered in sweat. Looking at the flying swords that were close at hand, they swallowed their saliva. The white deer immortal suddenly vanished. A streak of rainbow light entered the body of the heavy cavalry, and then this rider abruptly charged out of the formation, as fast as lightning. In the blink of an eye, he had arrived at Su Fengnian's side. Su Fengnian raised his scabbard and pointed a finger, and the golden-armored rider shattered with a boom. The colorful afterimage dissipated a few steps away from Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian did not move at all, his sleeves slightly fluttering. The streak of rainbow light suddenly transformed into 2 dots of golden light. With the golden-armored rider as the center, they drew 2 arcs in the air and crashed into the 2 riders on the opposite street. The 2 riders began to charge. Su Fengnian sheathed his scabbard. Before the 2 riders could reach within 10 paces, the golden-armored rider's head seemed to have been pierced by an arrow, and he died on the spot. The 2 dots of golden light split into 2, and the 4 heavy cavalry soldiers began to charge toward their deaths. The flying swords that Su Fengnian used to block Qi Jiajia's sword had already appeared. The flying sword that destroyed the enemy was the box of miniature flying swords that Dong Tai had given him at the Eastern Sea. After the battle of life and death with Han Xianxia, Su Fengnian had secretly replenished the 12 flying swords that had a perfect sword embryo. Wherever his mind willed, the sword would be there. Black armor, childhood sweetheart, morning dew, spring water, peach blossom, moth, vermilion bird, yellow tree, mayfly, gold-threaded tie. On the platform of the general, the brave soldiers were summoned. The 4 golden-armored riders were like eggs striking a stone. The 8 golden riders arrived again. After the death of the 8 riders, there were 16 riders surging forward. Su Fengnian's 12 swords were like a lightning pool. The golden-armored cavalry swore not to stop until they broke through the lightning pool. From afar, Dong Tai had an undisguised smile on his face. He clicked his tongue and said, This time you've learned from me. Luo Yang said unhappily. Just for show. Dong Tai raised his eyebrows and said, It's just for show and practical use. Don't speak against your will, right? Chao Chongqing listened to the quarrel between the two great grandmasters who were both ranked in the top 14 of the martial arts evaluation. He found it rather funny and said, What's there to argue about? At the two ends of the street, no less than 200 golden armored riders began to charge together with their spears. The large expanse of golden light reflected in their eyes made them feel as if they were in the majestic heavens. Even from a mile away, Chao Chongqing's face was illuminated with golden light. He squinted his eyes and said softly, Resisting the heavenly might of an immortal with the strength of a single person is not inferior to the Bailiang cavalry resisting the imperial edict of a mortal emperor. It's a pity that apart from the few of us, there aren't many people who are fortunate enough to see this scene. Dong Tai nodded in agreement and said, Thinking back to the few times when I was in the martial emperor city when others challenged Wang Xianji, or when others saw me, Dong Tai, climb the tower, they all paled in comparison. The 12 flying swords were like an impenetrable wall that could not be shaken by thousands of soldiers and horses. Outside the wall, more than 200 golden-armored celestial soldiers and generals crashed into the wall one by one without fear of death. The dense sound of thunder was incessant and gathered together, giving people the illusion that they were hearing thunder from the heavens. Many martial arts masters who were closely watching the movements of the imperial astronomer had no choice but to retreat. It was not that no one wanted to stay, but these masters were horrified to find that they were bleeding from their 7 orifices. When they wiped their hands, they were covered in blood. Only Wu Jian, the ancestor of the Wu family's sword tomb, Chai Qing-shan of the Dongyue sword pool, and a few other grandmasters were able to continue. The following scenes stirred people's hearts. More than 400 golden-armored celestial soldiers charged towards the young lord outside the imperial astronomer from the left and right. The light was so dazzling that it was as if the sun had risen from the eastern sea on the same day. A red sun rose from the imperial astronomer. Chapter 1636. The sun rose in the east. Even the citizens of Great Peace City were attracted by this soul-stirring scene and looked up. Mount Hui purple-robed Shenyuan Qingfeng had arrived at the Jojo restaurant at some point. She ordered the signature mutton hot pot from a young waiter who recognized her at a glance. She expressionlessly picked up her chopsticks. There was someone who was closer to the imperial astronomer than Wu Jian and Chai Qing-shan, and even closer than Luo Yang, Dong Tai, and Chao Chongqing. The young girl stood at the foot of a high wall. She reached out her hand to adjust the slanted sable hat that covered her eyes. No one knew when she had arrived. Not only did the immortals at the entrance of the imperial astronomer not notice, even Su Fengnian, who was focused on fighting the enemy, did not notice. And she was only one wall away from the heavy cavalry that had been reduced to pawns. As an assassin, she had not killed many people. More accurately, the number of people she had killed could be counted on one hand. For example, the world's 11th ranked Wang Mingyin, and the gatekeeper of the capital Lu Haosher, had clearly escaped the pursuit of Su Fengnian, who had been possessed by the Qin emperor. In the end, he had been killed by her and his head kicked around like a ball. Other than killing Su Fengnian, she had only made one mistake, and that was stopping Wang Xianji from entering Bailiang. This time, she would not allow herself to make a mistake. On the main street, the 400 cavalry began to charge at each other. If they were blocked by Su Fengnian's 12 flying swords again, then the next time, the remaining 1,000 or so cavalry would come out in full force. But Su Fengnian's flying swords had clearly been used up. The 8 flying swords were on the verge of shattering and had no choice but to return to his sleeves. In reality, Su Fengnian had been able to last for so long. If he had faced the elite cavalry of the mortal world, he would have been able to break armor 1600. The white deer immortal, who had transformed into a rainbow, did not give Su Fengnian a chance to catch his breath. The 400 cavalry had already arrived. The date mark on Su Fengnian's forehead glowed brightly. A trickle of blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. He raised his hands and began to form a sword. In his life, he had only used the 3-foot sword to kill dragons. Azure Dragon Sleeves. Back in the day, the old man with the sheepskin fur coat threatened to teach him this sword move that was as famous as the sword opens the gate of heaven. When he was young, His Royal Highness was still puzzled about how the one-armed old man had 2 sleeves. 60 years ago, there was only one person in the vast Jianghu. After 60 years, the Sword of Great Snow Plateau came. The unveiling of the young swordsman was to ride his sword and laugh loudly over Guangling. The old man's curtain call was at the riverside of Guangling, where he broke 2,600 pieces of armor with a single sword strike. When he entered the Jianghu, he was stunning. When he left the Jianghu, he was carefree. This was Li Chungang. For 1,000 years, there was only one person whose sword Dao could stand shoulder to shoulder with ancestor Lu. It was Li Chungang. Chao Chongqing and Dong Tai widened their eyes almost at the same time. Even the two Earth Immortals among the 4 Grandmasters of Wuxia reviews were somewhat confused and shocked. They could vaguely see an old man wearing a sheepskin coat standing beside Su Fengnian. This time, his appearance was different from the similar appearance on the streets of Mawei Post Station. This time, it was a divine resemblance. The hunchbacked old man stood behind the young vassal and smiled. "Brat, let's say goodbye this time. Don't bother this old man if you have nothing to do in the future. If you have to leave, leave. This old man has nothing to miss, so why can't you let go?" Su Fengnian nodded gently. In his 2 sleeves, an extremely majestic green qi madly flowed out. "Brat, are you going to learn from this old man and fight by the riverside? So stubborn? Won't you regret it? If I'm not stronger than her, I won't have the face to pick her up in the future." That's true. This old man was stronger than Green Pao Air in the past. Otherwise, she wouldn't have liked him. "All right, don't bully her just because you're stronger. This old man has been through this before. He knows that he will regret it. Remember, if you don't know how to cherish a woman because she likes you, you can't do that. I don't need you to nag. Brat. In the past, it was always you who acted cool. Why don't you take a good look at the last time?" "Sure." The 2 green dragons in his sleeves, one on the left and one on the right, were like a flood bursting through a dam, each like a great river rushing east and west. Li Chuangong's figure gradually dissipated. His eyes filled with nostalgia and agitation. Finally he softly said, "In the 100 years of Jianghu, there was me, Li Chungang, and Wang Xianji took over. Now there's also you, Su Fengnian. There's no harm in not having wine." As the 2 green dragons charged past, the majority of the 400-some golden-armored cavalry were thrown off their horses. 50 to 60 did their best to go against the flow, but the golden light on their bodies was still rapidly dissipating. The wall at the end of the street loudly collapsed. However, in this scene of utter defeat, there were 4 cavalry that stood out the most. Their official ranks in the army during their lives were not high, and their individual battle prowess was far inferior to that of the cavalry commanders. However, without exception, they were all cavalry that Xianxia and had personally selected from the main camp. Before this, they were unremarkable in Ma Lulong's heavy cavalry. At the time, when they were selected to join the Battle of the Imperial Astronomer, the 4 of them were actually baffled. They did not think too deeply about it, only believing that they had accidentally caught the discerning eye of a major figure in the army. Naturally, these 4 cavalry were unaware that in the eyes of the great general of the north, Ma Lulong, they were only ordinary members of the heavy cavalry. However, in the eyes of the Qi cultivator Grandmaster Xianxia, and each of them was an existence that possessed a certain type of destiny. The ancestors of these 4 cavalry came from Old Liang, Eastern Yu, Northern Han, and West Chu. As a result, they were the true trump cards to deal with Su Fengnian and Beiliang. They would be the most sinister trap in this battle. Although the momentum of the 4 cavalry that stood out from the crowd had been thwarted, they were still gradually closing in on Su Fengnian. The cavalry in the lead wielded a golden spear. His warhorse was only 5 paces away from Su Fengnian, unable to advance any further. With a mournful neigh, the warhorse raised its hooves high into the air. The cavalry thrust the tip of his spear forward inch by inch, piercing towards Su Fengnian's head. Finally, the warhorse could not hold on any longer. Its hooves smashed into the ground, and the spear continued to slide downwards. However, the spear was like snow approaching a furnace. It melted several inches away from Su Fengnian's shoulder. The Liang cavalry commandant, whose grandfather had been the great general of the East, was reduced to ashes. The invisible pillar of destiny that towered over the Eastern Yu capital seemed to have been struck by lightning, suddenly shaking. Next, in the territory of the old Northern Han, there was another wave of shock. Many of the spring and autumn survivors of the old Northern Han felt a mysterious sense of unease. In the imperial capital of West Chu, which had welcomed the first empress of the Central Plains, many scholars, Regardless of whether they were scholarly scholars reading books in their study or ignorant children reciting books in private schools, paused for a moment. Baffled, they continued to read. When the last heavy cavalry soldier whose father had died on the battlefield of the Western Wall shattered with golden light, a dragon's roar of grief and indignation resounded in the air above Great Peace City. Su Fengnian's body trembled slightly 4 times. The last time in particular, blood seeped out from between his eyebrows. 3 immortals seized the opportunity to attack, attempting to work together to seriously injure the young vassal king who was barely holding on. Su Fengnian exhaled heavily. The turbid air was filled with wisps of blood. After exhaling this breath of old qi and clotted blood, the hundreds of flying swords above his head seemed to descend. The 3 immortals safely circled around the falling rain, their figures light and agile. Between the gate of the imperial astronomer and the young vassal king, the 3 immortals of Mount Longhu flashed and appeared, quickly approaching Su Fengnian. These flying swords, which were unable to support themselves, only delayed them for a moment. But in this precious moment, Su Fengnian, with his thumb on the Bailiang saber on the left side of his waist, lightly pushed. The cold saber was almost completely unsheathed, leaving only the tip of the saber in the scabbard. Su Fengnian's feet were rooted to the ground, his body leaning back. The hilt of the cold saber, which had not been completely unsheathed, just happened to hit the chest of an immortal who was sweeping with a horsetail whisk. The immortal's body shattered like Kunlun jade. Su Fengnian's feet didn't move, but his body leaned backward. After the tip of the scabbard touched the ground lightly, he stood up straight again. With another push of the scabbard's hilt, the second immortal's immortal body was shattered by the cold blade in the same way. When the last immortal gave up the idea of close combat, Su Fengnian's 5 fingers suddenly clenched. The unsheathed cold saber trembled slightly. It did not continue to slide back into the scabbard, but went against the momentum of the attack. The immortals who were retreating suddenly had a clap of thunder behind them. The 3 immortals dissipated in the blink of an eye. More than 500 cavalrymen on the street were completely annihilated. At this moment, a petite figure swept toward the white deer, and her hand blade happened to stab the chest of the immortal who had just condensed on the back of the white deer. She succeeded in her attack and quickly retreated without hesitation. However, the explosion of the golden light still smashed into her body. On her route of retreat, she passed through several walls. When she finally stopped in the distance, she coughed out a mouthful of blood. Then she adjusted her mink hat, raised her arm to wipe the corner of her mouth, and lightly leapt up to sit on the wall. She took out a scallion pancake from her pocket that she had bought on the way here, and lowered her head to take a big bite. Chao Chongqing and Dong Tai looked at each other and smiled. Killing an immortal and eating a pancake, they really brought out the best in each other. At the gate of the imperial astronomer, after the white deer immortal was mysteriously ambushed by a little girl, the Lotus Crown Taoist master and the first ancestor finally made their move at the same time. A small crack had appeared on the tip of Su Fengnian's foot. It was because he did not retreat half a step and let the soles of his shoes rub against the ground. Although the 3 immortals did not succeed and could not retreat, just like how Su Fengnian's sword had delayed their advance, they also successfully delayed Su Fengnian's breathing. The first ancestor of Mount Longhu floated over with the sword in his hand. Su Fengnian had not recovered his breathing, and still forcefully clashed with the first ancestor. The blade in his left hand was finally unsheathed. The old cold blade clashed with the first ancestor's sword. The young first ancestor with a face as clear as jade slid back tens of feet, almost crashing into the gate of the imperial astronomer. But his smile was still bright. Su Fengnian took 10 steps forward and only took 9 steps back. But the Lotus Crown Taoist master's body directly passed through the first ancestor. The 2 immortals exchanged positions. The first ancestor's palm struck Su Fengnian's forehead, and spat out 2 words. Mountain Splitter. Su Fengnian's head slightly swayed backwards, his heels leaving the ground, the tip of his foot stepping hard on the ground. 1 step. Just 1 step back. But he still did not retreat from the position where he faced off against the 60 immortals. Chapter 1637. The old Taoist master with the lotus crown, who had struck Su Fengnian's forehead with his palm, floated backward. At the same time, the sword-wielding immortal passed through this straight path and said with a smile, "Mountains and rivers filled with wind and lightning." Su Fengnian stepped forward, holding the saber with both hands, and slashed down without hesitation. The saber was held vertically and the sword was held horizontally. Between the saber and the sword, the wind and clouds surged and thunder rumbled. The two sleeves of the young ancestor's Taoist robe fluttered wildly, and the hair on Su Fengnian's temples also fluttered wantonly. The immortal with the lotus crown almost overlapped with the immortal with the sword. His right palm passed through the saber and sword and pushed hard on Su Fengnian's chest. As if to increase the supreme power of this palm, the old immortal pressed his left hand on the back of his right hand and shouted, "Heaven Ascension!" Layer after layer of vigorous strength, like an immortal ascending the stairs, endlessly passed through Su Fengnian's chest, to the extent that Su Fengnian's back, which corresponded to his chest, suddenly fluttered. Su Fengnian's lips moved slightly, but he didn't make a sound. His face was pale and purple. Saber 9. The next moment, the two immortals stood side by side at the entrance of the Imperial Astronomer. Although they did not show any lingering fear on their faces, compared to their previous calmness, they were a little more dignified. Su Fengnian did not retreat. Instead, he advanced. The immortal with the sword waved his sleeve, raised his arm and held his sword horizontally, as if he was going to block the young lord's path. Su Fengnian's chest and back were already bleeding. Between his eyebrows, there was a shocking crack. But he still rushed forward. Chao Chongqing was a little speechless. Dong Tai sighed and said, "This is really going to be a desperate fight." It turned out that the man and the immortal had exchanged a move. It was a very simple move. Yu Leijian pierced Su Fengnian's chest, and the cold saber pierced the immortal's chest. Su Fengnian pushed his saber forward. Yu Leijian and the first ancestral master of Longhu Mountain were sent flying through the gates of the Imperial Astronomer. Not only that, but even the Li family's infantry formation was broken through. Su Fengnian, king of Beiliang. Just like that, he entered the gates of the Imperial Astronomer. ## number 254 Lu Dongxian is bold. If someone could ride the wind and look down at the Imperial Astronomer, they would be able to see a thin silver thread easily cutting through a large piece of thick black cloth. Together, Su Fengnian and the first ancestor of Longhu Mountain, who had graced the world with his presence, broke through the Li family's armored infantry formation. Li Shogua, the commandant of Jianghu's sagging commandant, who was leading the charge, was unfortunately right in front of the formation. This general's chest seemed to have been hit by a battering ram, and he fell roughly 7 or 8 feet away. Beside him were his subordinates who were in the same situation. Even though they were wearing heavy armor, most of the soldiers still fainted directly. Occasionally, there were strands of painful groans. The dizzy Li Shogua shook his head hard and bit his lips to wake himself up. He tried his best to open his eyes and turned his head with difficulty to look at the two culprits who had broken through the formation. One of the figures, who was not wearing a python robe and was wearing plain silk, had already sheathed his saber. He waved it gently and directly shook off the chaotic purple lightning on the tip of the saber. His back was soaked in scarlet blood, like blood in snow, and was particularly eye-catching. To Li Shogua's horror, a fist-sized hole appeared on the chest of the sword-wielding immortal. However, what was even more inconceivable was that the sword-wielding immortal still had a nonchalant expression on his face. The sword-wielding immortal's body was like a woman whose finger was pierced by an embroidery needle, causing a drop of blood to appear. The old Taoist with the lotus crown stood beside the sword-wielding immortal. The sword-wielding immortal stared at the young king and said with a smile, "It's okay. This guy still hasn't used Beiliang's providence. Since he's so arrogant, it doesn't matter if he gets stabbed 7 or 8 more times. It's not a loss for me to exchange my life with such a method." Unlike the various auspicious signs of other immortals, the old Taoist with the lotus crown on his head was wearing an old and ordinary Taoist robe. He did not have the purple and yellow color of the Taoist master's residence. In fact, this was normal. As the first immortal protector of the old Liang, the dragon Tiger Mountain had not yet risen at that time. Although it had proclaimed itself as the ancestral court of Taoism, the orthodoxy of the world still only recognized Wudong, which had produced many immortals of the great Feng dynasty. Although the old Taoist had attacked Su Fengnian twice, his aura was completely different from most of the younger immortals of the Zhao family. At this time, the old Taoist looked at the young king who still had not taken a breath and sighed. "Why bother? Su Fengnian, do you know how many things you've given up along the way? Zhenwu's Dharmakaya, Emperor Qin's aura, it's not a big deal. After all, the things of hundreds and thousands of years are too fleeting. But now, you don't even care about your life in this life?" Su Fengnian ignored the old Taoist's question and looked up at the heavenly platform of the Imperial Astronomer. Both sides knew that when Su Fengnian took a breath, It was the time for the Sword Immortal and the old Taoist to attack with all their strength. Whether the Taoist was a foot taller or the devil was 10 feet taller, each would show his or her magical power. The reason why the old Taoist had the mood to chat with the young king was not because he had good intentions. It was just that the two of them had a higher chance of winning if the battle dragged on. Their immortal bodies could be broken, but they would not be injured. However, Su Fengnian was different. The so-called land immortal was still a human after all. Even the celestial being Gao Shulu, who had been punished by heaven, could not be compared with a real immortal in terms of physique. The thing that really puzzled the two ancestors of Dragon Tiger Mountain was that Su Fengnian knew that immortals had no impurities and could not be hurt even by divine weapons. However, as long as there was impurities, it would be fatal. It would directly reduce the good karma accumulated in several or even dozens of lifetimes. Therefore, Su Fengnian's real weapon was not the ordinary Bailiang saber, but Bailiang's fate. Su Fengnian withdrew his gaze and suddenly smiled. Old Taoist, I'm very grateful for the two moves of Mountain Splitter and Heaven Ascension. I don't return the favor. Before he could finish his words, Su Fengnian had already disappeared and appeared in front of the old Taoist without any warning. His cold saber swept across the old Taoist's head. The old Taoist smiled and put his hands behind his back. He took a few small steps back. Lotus flowers bloomed under his feet. His figure was elegant, but his clothes did not move at all. The celestial being did not overstep the rules. The young king did not seem to realize that his efforts were futile. The cold saber continued to sweep. However, just when the old Taoist was about to stand still, another Su Fengnian appeared in front of him. He followed him like a shadow and continued to maintain the same posture. The cold saber swept across the old Taoist's head. The old Taoist took a few more steps to the side, strolling leisurely, and dodged the sharp cold saber. Although it was the same as the invincible Vajra, described in the Buddhist scriptures, the old Taoist did not believe that this young man really did not know how to play tricks. He did not believe that this young man would stupidly use the cold saber to chop people from the beginning to the end and then exhaust himself to death. This young king of the Northwest who had ascended to the top of the human world was originally a difficult opponent with endless tricks. Especially when he even killed Wang Xianji, it was hard to guarantee that he did not have any hidden skills. The old Taoist was happy to wait and see. He might as well deal with the changes by sticking to the status quo. Now, it should be the injured Su Fengnian who was flustered and exasperated. The old Taoist only needed to wait patiently for the crucial moment when the young man could not help but do something desperate. The old Taoist with the lotus crown used the dipper steps to shrink the world. Every time he changed his position, it seemed to be only 2 or 3 steps, but it was enough to make the cold saber miss. Because the two people in a life-and-death situation attacked too quickly, in the blink of an eye, no less than 100 Su Fengnian appeared on the square of the imperial astronomer. The immortal surnamed Zhao of Longhu Mountain was still at ease, moving freely through the increasingly narrow square like a fish swimming leisurely in the Jianghu. The first Grandmaster of Longhu Mountain, holding the seal sword Yulei, was not in a hurry to rescue the Su Fengnian. 1. There was no need for him to do anything. 2. Every moment that passed meant that the rope around the neck of the approaching Su Fengnian was getting tighter and tighter. The person holding the rope just so happened to be the Su Fengnian himself. His right hand held the sword in front of him in a standing sword stance. His left hand bent his thumb and lightly pierced his index finger. Then he began to draw seals on the peachwood sword that was rumored to have killed countless demons and monsters. The blood that flowed out of his index finger was not bright red, but pure white. Moreover, it was bright and resplendent, like the bright moon hanging from his fingertip. Several chi channels that had been suppressed by various buildings in Great Peace City quickly surged toward the imperial astronomer. When the seal was formed, victory was already in his grasp. Chapter 1638. The lips of the always youthful and elegant immortal curled up. Can you tolerate me drawing seals so openly? In the eyes of the Liyang soldiers who did not have outstanding martial cultivation, dozens of King of Bailiang appeared in the square in the blink of an eye. In another blink, there were more than 100 people. The 1,000 or so soldiers of the Li family who had not been knocked unconscious were all dumbstruck and could only stare. Deep in their hearts, these Liyang elites had complicated feelings. They were more wary and fearful of the arrogant and domineering young king, but their hatred was less. It seemed absurd, but the logic was actually very simple. In the early days of the Jianghu, how many beauties in the world did not love Li Chungang? How many martial artists in the world did not revere Wang Xianji? To be with them and live in the world, as long as it did not involve irreconcilable personal grudges, most people would yearn to be with them. Li Yang's reverence for martial power was based on iron hooves and knives. Xianxia was dressed in white, so why was he able to become the teacher of so many dragon descendants in Great Peace City? Why did the Tongxi sword immortal Liu Baijie make an exception and enter the capital to become the Minister of War and fill the streets with cheers? Recently, a shocking piece of news spread. It was said that the young king of Bailiang had once fought alone with the Baimang military god Tuoba Bodhisattva in the western regions and fought until the sky turned dark. No matter what the scholars and civil officials of Great Peace City thought, men who were paid by the soldiers would talk about such things. It was most likely that the young King Su was just bragging and creating momentum for his trip to the capital. But no matter what the truth was, most of the martial artists in the army would feel some regret. They would wonder why the Su Fengnian did not simply kill that Tuoba Bodhisattva in the western regions. If he had really taken his head, then they, who lived off the soldiers of the emperor, would just be a bit more virtuous when they scolded him in the future. On the contrary, the Li family's armored soldiers had initially revered the immortal who treated human lives like grass, but they quickly developed a sense of enmity. Su Fengnian had killed hundreds of armored cavalry in one go on the street. It was true that his methods were ruthless, but the heavy cavalry of unknown origin had suddenly turned into golden-armored immortals. Such an immortal's method was really too chilling. Originally, when facing a strong enemy, we martial artists would treat it as a trip to the battlefield. If we died in battle, then so be it. But if we died for no reason, how sullen would that be? Where would there be heroism? Probably no one would die in peace. On the high wall, Luo Yang held the wine pot with 2 fingers. She smiled and said, "Chao Chongqing cannot interfere, but you, Dong Tai, you have some relations with him. Are you just going to watch here?" There was no one nearby. Dong Tai was not the kind of person who liked to pretend to be an expert. At this time, he was squatting at Chao Chongqing's feet. He said unhappily, "That fart of connections? Back in the Eastern Sea, they were all used up." Chao Chongqing joked, "Don't make things difficult for our peach blossom sword god. Of course, I cannot interfere in this fight. But in fact no one can. Just like yesterday at the Mawei post station. In the end, it was just me and Dong Tai against one. But I think you, Luo Yang, also know that at our position, numbers don't mean much. Of course, face is also very important." Dong Tai seemed to remember something. In terms of connections, that elusive ancestor Lu should be the one helping, right? Luo Yang hesitated for a moment, then said, "That person was to Gao Tingshu, just like Wang Xianji was to Li Chungang. And now, he is to Wang Xianji. So who's next?" Even Dong Tai was stunned. He turned to glance at Chao Chongqing. The latter nodded slightly. Dong Tai was suddenly angry. He cursed for the first time. Damn it, why is this kid so miserable? Was he supposed to be subdued by Ancestor Lu's reincarnation? Luo Yang said sarcastically, "What do you think?" Then, Luo Yang glanced at the sky. The cycle of the heavenly Tao is clear. Chao Chongqing said slowly, "Since Ancestor Lu could even withdraw from the heavenly gate, he might not act according to this logic." Dong Tai sneered. "What a good might not." Luo Yang smiled and said, "You're not happy?" Dong Tai took a deep breath. "Forget it. Even if I was willing to help, that kid wouldn't be willing." Luo Yang drank a mouthful of wine. Her expression was calm. "That's true." Dong Tai suddenly stood up. He shook his wrist and said in a deep voice, "Su Fengnian will settle the grudge of the imperial astronomer himself. Dying here is his fate. Anyway, if he survives today, his future might not be good. But Xie Guanying, that nimble old rabbit, Dong Tai, will properly pursue him this time." After passing Xiangfan City in Qingzhou, one would reach the middle and lower reaches of the Guangling River. A young Taoist priest and his disciple sat cross-legged on the riverbank. The little Taoist boy began to doze off as he pondered. The young Taoist priest didn't reprimand him. Every time the little Taoist was about to fall, he would reach out and support him. This young Taoist priest in plain robes was Li Yufu, Wudong's current leader. He brought his disciple Yufu along the Guangling River to escort the arowana into the sea. Suddenly, Li Yufu's body trembled. He heard 2 words softly. "Yufu." Li Yufu slowly turned his head and saw a young Taoist priest sitting beside him with a warm smile. The Taoist priest and his disciple Yufu sat on Li Yufu's left and right. Li Yufu's eyes were filled with tears. He was about to stand up and bow. The man quickly waved his hand and said, "Don't. We don't do this on the mountain." But Li Yufu still insisted on standing up. He was respectful and choked with sobs. "I'm Li Yufu. Greetings to the young martial uncle." The young Taoist priest, who was called young martial uncle by Li Yufu, looked helpless. "You're just like senior brother Yu. I'm afraid of you. When we were on the mountain, even the eldest senior brother who was in charge of discipline was not as particular as senior brother Yu. At that time, His Royal Highness would give out books after beating people. Well, you know, the kind with more pictures than words. Every time eldest senior brother found it, he would not throw it away. Only senior brother Yu would pull my ear and scold me when he found it. So Yufu, if you meet a young Taoist priest on the mountain who secretly hides such books, just scold him. Don't beat him. It's okay if you really want to beat him, but remember to tell him that when you are successful in cultivation, you will return the books to him. That's what eldest senior brother told me. You see, didn't I become successful in the end? Li Yufu raised his arm and wiped his eyes. He smiled knowingly. The young martial uncle of Wudong Mountain was Li Yufu's young martial uncle. Then it could only be Hong Xixiang, who rode a green ox and smiled when he met people. The young martial uncle looked at the torrential Guangling River across the Central Plains. He was lost in thought for a moment and then said, "I had no choice but to leave in a muddy water. This time, other than wanting to say hello to you personally, I also want to borrow your sword." Li Yufu didn't look confused at all. He just nodded solemnly. Hong Xixiang looked up at the sky. "I didn't go that year, and I won't go in the future. So, I have to trouble you with that matter." Li Yufu's eyes were clear and firm. "Don't worry, young martial uncle." The two stood up together. Hong Xixiang patted Li Yufu's shoulder and smiled. "You're more responsible than me. If only you went up the mountain earlier. I'll definitely lend you the books." Li Yufu smiled. There was no thought of the tall image of young martial uncle collapsing in his mind. This kind of young martial uncle was exactly his young martial uncle. Li Yufu took the peachwood sword from his back and handed it to young martial uncle. Hong Xixiang took the peachwood sword and looked down at the little Taoist boy. He suddenly said to Li Yufu, "Yufu, don't be confused by the word longevity in cultivation. You can't be an immortal wholeheartedly. Help me tell this to myself." Li Yufu replied, "I will." Hong Xixiang gently threw the ordinary Wudong peach wood sword into the Guangling River. He smiled gently. "I've been cultivating for 800 years, and I've never taken anyone's head with a flying sword. Let's go." The moment Hong Xixiang threw the peachwood sword, thunder rumbled and the momentum suddenly overwhelmed the river waves. It was as if a celestial was sitting high in the clouds and shouting to the human world. "Lu Dongxian, how dare you?" Hong Xixiang looked up and laughed. "I've been bold for 800 years. The peachwood sword that was still in the scabbard first hovered on the river surface for a moment and then disappeared in a flash. The celestial above was suddenly silent. Li Yufu looked at the river surface and did not turn his head. Young martial uncle left. 3 feet of spirit. 1,000 years of elegance. Chapter 1639. Previously, the hundreds of golden-armored knights had charged with a bright aura like the sun rising in Great Peace City. Then, the first ancestral master of Dragon Tiger Mountain drew seals on the Yulei ancient sword, and it was like the moon rising. Those Jianghu masters who were lucky enough to get close to the imperial astronomer were all amazed. However, most of the martial arts grandmasters of Liang, who had been hiding in the abyss, were cautious about this inexplicable change. They did not dare to get too close to the imperial astronomer. Some of the grandmasters who had sensed the danger even began to take the initiative to retreat, fearing that they would be implicated. It should be noted that about 60 years ago on Mount Longhu, thousands of people had witnessed the unexpected disaster when the great immortal Qi Xuanzhen ascended in broad daylight. The scene was still vivid in the minds of the older generation of Jianghu legends. No one knew how many masters had their Qi momentum severely damaged when the great immortal Qi Xuanzhen was killed. However, compared to the demon execution platform of the Taoist Master Mansion, the Imperial College was a top-level important place in the capital. Most of the people of Jianghu were blocked outside by the heavily guarded Imperial Guards. These Liang elites were even able to ride their horses in the area between the Imperial College and the inner city under the urgent orders of the Ministry of War to prevent too many outsiders from getting close to the Imperial astronomer. Also, the few remaining copper fishbag masters of the Ministry of Justice moved out in full force and tried to reason with the famous Jianghu masters. If they really couldn't do it, they didn't care about the relationships they had built up over the years and just threw away all pretense of cordiality. If they didn't leave this place, then they would have to go to the Ministry of Justice's prison. Even so, there were still 20 to 30 Master Realm Masters who managed to get close to the Imperial astronomer. They could even clearly see the figures of Dong Tai, Chao Chongqing, and Luo Yang on the high wall not far away. When they reached this area, the Imperial Guards and the Copper Fishbag Masters of the Ministry of Justice didn't care. The orders from above were that they only needed to record the names and sex of these Jianghu people who didn't follow the rules. There was no need to fight with them. Afterwards, the Ministry of War and the Ministry of Justice would use military force to chase them out of the city. They wouldn't be able to enter Great Peace City for the next 10 years. Everyone liked being able to watch a show without spending money, but not everyone had the confidence to join in the fun at the feet of the Emperor and the Dragon Throne. These 30 or so Jianghu bigwigs, excluding the 10 or so people who had left on their own accord, and the 8 or 9 pitiful insects who had fainted due to the Imperial astronomer's astonishing chi, there were still 10 or so people who were bitterly persevering. They were all standing on the eaves of the roof or on the top of the wall, not too far away. Most of the chi in their bodies was surging like a river, and their complexions were not good. As for those meaningless acts of clapping and cheering, it was even more impossible for them to appear at this time and place. Firstly, their status and position were there, and it was not appropriate for them to be startled. Secondly, the imposing manner of the Imperial astronomer was too swift and fierce. It was already not easy for them to stand firm, so how could they pretend to pass judgment on the world? After Chai Ching Shan of the Dongyue sword pool and his 2 disciples tossed the 8 or 9 unlucky fellows far away, they came to the roof of a restaurant. A young girl in white, who carried so many swords on her back that she looked like a sword seller, stood beside her master. This young beauty from a famous sect, with her fluttering white clothes, already had the demeanor of a fairy. The young man, Song Tinglu, who only had a long sword, threw an unconscious burly man to a group of Imperial Army cavalry with a dark face. Panting, he returned to the side of his master and junior sister and complained, "If you have the strength, you should just hit a few kilograms of iron. I really don't know what these fellows were thinking. If it weren't for us cleaning up the mess, they would have really died here. Decades of hard work and cultivation, and they lost their lives for no reason. Is it worth it?" Chai Ching Shan did not expel the sect leaders, or itinerant immortals who were considered famous in the Liang River Lake. He chuckled softly and said, "This kind of risky action seems absurd and laughable, but it is actually in accordance with the rules of Jianghu. When they leave Great Peace City and go to the counties, they can tell others about this unprecedented battle, and tell others that they were only a few feet away from the king of Beiliang. Just imagine how much glory it will bring to them. When you are in Jianghu, especially when you have reached a certain height, the superficial things are sometimes more useful than the reputation you earned with your fists. For example, the day before yesterday, I chatted with Lu Baijie, the sword immortal of Tongxi, who was the Minister of War. Yesterday, I had a sword discussion with Mr. First, Qi Jiajie. Today, I saw the king of Beiliang fight with my own eyes. Which of his moves were truly profound, and which of his moves were actually similar to my own sect's guarding skills? These are all golden signboards, and great topics of conversation that can sway the minds of the listeners." The young man pointed at the Imperial astronomer who was still far away from them and rolled his eyes. "That's only a few feet away? It's almost 2 miles away." Lord Chao, the peach blossom sword deity, and the white-clothed devil, the 3 great grandmasters, don't even dare to say that they are only a few feet away from the Imperial astronomer, okay? Can these people be any more shameless? Song Tinglu's voice was not soft. Not far away, the youngest of the Jianghu seniors who were already in their 40s heard him clearly. However, none of them blushed. They either crossed their arms over their chests or clasped their hands behind their backs and stood at a high place. They still had the demeanor of a great grandmaster. Chai Ching Shan reached out his hand and pressed it on the young man's head. He smiled bitterly and said, "You don't know how expensive oil and salt are until you are in charge. In the future, when Master is no longer here, you will be the head of the Dongyue sword pool. You will know that the words you said today might not be able to buy back a favor even if you spend hundreds of thousands of taels of silver." Song Tinglu carefully glanced at his junior sister. The latter made a face and said loudly, "I don't want to be the sect leader." "You can be the sect leader. I want to be chivalrous and walk the Jianghu like that Su Fengnian. As long as he has walked through the provinces, climbed the famous mountains, and entered the restaurants and tea houses, I want to walk through them all." Song Tinglu's lips moved slightly, but in the end, he could not say a single harsh word. Was it true that behind every junior sister who was moved by love and did not hesitate, there was a senior brother who was her childhood sweetheart who was secretly sad? Chapter 1640. Chai Qingshan suddenly reached out and grabbed Shan Yi and Song Tinglu. He said in a deep voice, "Aside from winning reputation, you can also use the opportunity to practice martial arts. The key is whether you can calm down and comprehend the heavenly Tao. It's not without reason that Martial Emperor City was so lively back then. Shenyuan Qingfeng set up a father-son game and a grandfather-grandson game on the snowfield. Why were there so many people watching? It's actually very simple. There are opportunities in it. Next, if Chao Deng Luo and the other two fight, you must open your eyes wide to see the essence of it. It will be very beneficial for your martial arts cultivation in the future. Among them, Dong Tai's fight is the most important. After all, this peach blossom sword god is very likely to use his sword today. Whatever master knows, he will definitely teach you. You will definitely be able to learn it. It's just a matter of time. However, to witness Deng Tai's sword with your own eyes, this might be the only time in your lives." The girl seemed to not care about her future at all. She asked with a heartless smile, "Master, he will definitely win, right?" Chai Qingshan subconsciously looked at the cloudless sky and murmured, "God knows." Song Tinglu began to count in his heart. Han Shengxian, Wang Xianji, Sui Xiegu, Qi Jiajia, Chao Chongqing, Dong Tai. He knew of these fights, but Su Fengnian either won or tied. He actually didn't lose a single fight? The young man couldn't help but feel a little indignant. One had to know that the swordsman with a wooden sword whom he admired didn't seem to have won a single fight in Great Peace City. The first ancestor of Longhu Mountain was drawing talismans smoothly. Even if this immortal deliberately slowed down to increase the thickness of the talisman, the young king still showed no signs of stopping him. The closer it was to the end of the fight, the more the odds of victory favored Longhu Mountain. The old Taoist with the lotus crown looked more and more solemn, and he even couldn't suppress his fear. Not to mention the old Taoist who had achieved the status of an immortal after several generations of good deeds. Even before he ascended, he had been guarding the old Liang dynasty for 30 years as the immortal protector. He had never experienced such a strange feeling. The Taoists cultivated tranquility. The secular world thought that the so-called tranquility of the heart was like a pool of stagnant water. In fact, that was not the case. When the heart rippled, the state of mind would still have tranquility amidst the movement. That was true tranquility. This was somewhat similar to the movement of the Buddhist heart banner, but it was also different. An immortal's Tao heart was stable without impurities. If an immortal's body was stained with impurities, it might not cause the Tao heart to shake. However, if there were cracks in the latter, it would definitely affect the true impurities. Therefore, the lotus-crowned old Taoist knew that he had to follow his heart. Immortals followed their hearts and followed the will of heaven. The old Taoist was no longer rigid like the fish swimming under the bridge that the Taoist Saint Lao Zhuang had mentioned. As an immortal in heaven who had already jumped over the dragon gate, he wanted to jump out of the water to take a look and take the initiative to merge with the heavenly Tao. Then, the old immortal tapped the ground with the tip of his foot and leaped into the air. As the lotus-crowned old Taoist rose into the air, a young lord rose with him. The cold knife in his hand was still in the boring horizontal knife style. When his body was almost at the same level as the beam of the Tongtian platform, the old Taoist waved his sleeve and stretched out his jade-white palm. His palm faced up and then suddenly pressed down. He laughed loudly and said, "Where the Dharma seal shines, it shines brightly. All evils retreat." Not only did the young lord in front of the old Taoist disappear, but hundreds of young lords in the square also disappeared in an instant. They were like ghosts in the night who suddenly encountered the sun in the sky. The old Taoist looked around and did not see any Su Fengnian. The lotus-crowned immortal shouted softly and raised his hands up. "The Taoist is 1 foot tall and the devil is 10 feet tall." Su Fengnian came to the top of the immortal's head. He held the knife in his left hand and chopped down. At this moment, the old Taoist sneered, "How can such a small trick deceive the heaven's heart?" The old Taoist's hands did not move, but at the same time, the old Taoist also transformed into 4 immortals in front, back, left, and right. 4 Dharma forms. Each formed a lotus golden body. He stretched out his palm and a lotus bloomed in his palm. His 2 fingers were together like a sword and pointed to the sky. His 5 fingers opened and then clenched, and a light beam went straight to the sky. It was like holding a long spear that penetrated the heaven and earth. But the 5 Su Fengnian flashed and disappeared in an instant. The old Taoist, who seemed to have 3 heads and 6 arms, frowned and looked around blankly. His eyes were like torches, shining with purple gold. Finally here. The founder of the first generation who drew the talisman on the Yulei sword sneered. His finger on the tip of the sword gently knocked. His body slightly leaned forward, and gently breathed on the tip of the sword. Seal! It was a simple word, but it was like a big bell that rang in the sky of the imperial astronomer. Words were the law of heaven. One word could decide one's life and death. The talisman sword did not move, but a 3-foot golden light swept out from the sword. The golden light swirled and lingered around the immortal holding the sword. Wherever the golden light went, talismans appeared out of thin air, like the spring couplets that a devout child pasted on the door. The earth cracked, the rain stopped, the grass and trees turned to ashes, the birds fell to the ground, and the dragons and tigers were subdued. Between the immortal holding the sword on the ground and the Taoist with the lotus crown in the sky, talismans hung. From the latter to the former, intermittent pages of talismans exploded one after another. Golden light sputtered, and occasionally drops fell to the ground. The square that was as hard as iron suddenly shot out stones. The Taoist with the lotus crown who turned to look down suddenly narrowed his eyes and laughed. Evil creature, still not showing yourself? At the same time, the immortal holding the sword casually flicked the tip of the sword in the air, and turned to the heavenly platform and shouted, "What are you waiting for?" The Confucian scholar Xie Guanyin, who had been watching the fire from the other side of the river, was originally paying attention to the movements in the palace hall. It seemed that he did not see the result he wanted, but it was also within his expectations. There was a faint coldness on his face. After hearing the 2 immortals' calls, he no longer hesitated and suddenly shook his shoulders and raised his sleeves. The world's cool breeze, wrapped in 2 sleeves. The great rivers and mountains, carried on one shoulder. 8 seals rise. In the sky of the imperial astronomer, 8 different-sized imperial jade seals suddenly appeared. The first ancestor of Mount Longhu grabbed the hilt of the Yulei sword with both hands and pulled it back. The Taoist with the lotus crown raised his hands as if he was lifting something heavy, and lifted it up toward his left shoulder. A long golden rope as thick as a spear shaft appeared in the hands of the 2 immortals. The immortals sat in the clouds, fishing for the fate of the mortal world. If the fishing line that was tens of thousands of feet long was twisted into a rope, it would be the golden rope in the hands of the 2 immortals. This rope went straight through one of Su Fengnian's shoulders. It nailed the young lord in the air, unable to move at all. Blood soaked the long rope. Chapter 1641. Su Fengnian closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He finally breathed. It was as though he wanted to use this breath to vent all the anger in his chest and absorb the fortune of the world. But according to reason, this was not the time to breathe. Xie Guanying's lips curled. He raised his arm and lightly waved a finger. Do not look at indecent things. The Confucians have set the rules for the world for almost 800 years. You, Su Fengnian, cannot lower your head to the heavenly Tao, but since you still live in the world, how can you not bow to the heavens and earth? As this scholar's finger pointed, 2 jade seals exploded towards Su Fengnian's eyes. Xie Guanying moved his finger again and continued to say casually, "Do not listen to indecent things." The 2 jade seals flew towards Su Fengnian's ears. When Xie Guanying said the words, "Do not speak indecent things," it was as though the 5th jade seal had heard it and moved. The beam under Xie Guanying's feet that led out of the pavilion of heaven-reaching pavilion was unable to bear the weight and started to crack. Life and death were hanging by a thread. Su Fengnian jerked the corner of his mouth. When the time comes, the heavens and earth will work together. The heavens and earth have reason and then etiquette. You, Xie Guanying, think that you hold the rules of etiquette, but that may not be the reason of the heavens and earth. At the very least, that Duke Yanxing who sent me an item before leaving, he does not feel that you, Xie Guanying, are in the right. A pendant fell from Su Fengnian's waist. It was a square object. Just as the 5 jade seals were a hair's breadth away from each other, Su Fengnian had a thought. Do not move if you are wrong. Not only did the 4 jade seals vibrate violently, the other 4 jade seals that Xie Guaniying had not moved also vibrated. Back then, when His Royal Highness had returned from his second journey, the old man had pointed at a piece of meat cut from the vassal king and said to his son that in the future, it would be up to the young to reason with others. This time, he had forced his way into the imperial astronomer of Great Peace City. No matter how vicious his methods were, the expression of the young vassal king could be said to be warm and calm. At least, he was not angry or vicious. Su Fengnian, who was hung in the air by the long golden rope, began to walk with his saber. He walked toward the Tongtian platform, toward Xie Guaniying, who had schemed against him, Su Fengnian, and Beiliang. The long rope was pulled in a semicircle. The tip of Mount Longhu's founder's Yulei sword and the hands of the Lotus Crown Immortal both appeared to be struck by lightning. The two immortals stamped their feet almost at the same time, trying their best to stop the long rope's swift and violent momentum. Xie Guaniying's face was filled with shock. His gaze flashed across 2 places. One was on the roof of the Imperial Palace, the other was outside the city to the south of Great Peace City, and the other was in the capital area further south. He was both shocked and furious. Zhao Zhuan, Tantai Pingjing, Duke Yanxing, you dare to work together to ruin my great cause. Su Fengnian, whose shoulder was still pinned by the long rope, swung his saber. Xie Guaniying, who was standing on the beam of the Tongtian platform, grabbed the 4 jade seals and arranged them in a line to protect him and Su Fengnian's saber. He himself flashed away, allowing the 4 jade seals to fall to the ground, and the beam under his feet to break in 2. Under the saber, the entire towering Tongtian pavilion was cut in 2. Thousands of feet up in the sky, the saber seemed to have crashed into something with a bang. The 2 immortals looked at each other. After their gazes met, they released their hands almost at the same time. After Su Fengnian's saber, he turned and sneered. Want to leave? The Taoist with a lotus crown who had a red thread crawling on his sleeve sighed. He pulled all the long ropes with one hand and pulled back the red thread that was about to continue spreading, allowing the 2 red threads to freely dance around his sleeve. The old Taoist nodded slightly to the young Taoist who had abandoned the talisman sword. The latter had a complicated expression on his face. The 2 scarlet red threads were actually mixed with Han Shengxuan's death aura and Qi Jiajia's sword aura. Both of them came from Liang Imperial Court and died for the Zhao family. Using the fate of the Zhao family in Liang to attack the fate of the Zhao family in Mount Longhu was self-contradictory and wonderful. Presumably, this was the trump card used by the young king to destroy the immortal's purity. The next moment, the Taoist with the lotus crown, who knew that he could not escape, stood a few steps away from the ancestor of Mount Longhu and gently bowed to bid farewell. It was better for one person to die in reincarnation than both of them to die in the human world. A mirror appeared behind the old Taoist. It was the treasure of the Guanyin sect in the South Sea, the water-moon sky well that suppressed countless people with great fate in the world. The old Taoist was forcibly dragged into the well and whispered, "As long as the heavenly Tao does not collapse, the incense will not be extinguished. Respectfully send the ancestor back to the heavenly gate." Looking at the young Taoist who seemed to be the descendant of the old Taoist, he ignored the Taoist with the lotus crown who was ready to die. He only raised his hands and asked himself, "Where is the first?" The few remaining immortals of Mount Longhu on the square of the imperial astronomer all showed a sorrowful expression. While the immortals were heartbroken, they also felt an indescribable sense of awe. This time, it could be said that no one had ever come to the human world together. How could they be reduced to such a miserable state? On the other hand, the 2 younger immortals of Mount Longhu, Zhao Shi and Zhao Danxia, who had less experience than the ancestors of the past, looked relieved. They looked at each other and smiled. Although there was bitterness, there was no fear. A voice came from above the head of the ancestor, containing a strong sense of sarcasm. "At your grandmother's house." The young immortal suddenly raised his head, finally unable to hide his anger. He was so angry that he laughed and said, "Do you really think that I don't dare to risk my life and perish together with you, Su Fengnian?" Su Fengnian stood in the air, too lazy to talk nonsense with this immortal. Just as he was about to attack, his shoulder suddenly tilted, as if someone had patted him. A series of words softly sounded in his ears. "Kid, not bad. You've already broken that old bastard Xie Guaniying's broken bowl. You don't have to care about what happens next. Don't thank me, Dong Tai. This sword of mine was comprehended by me, Ma Wei, yesterday." This sword is called Will Spirit. Chapter 1642. If you think the name isn't good enough, you can give me a more imposing one later. Just like the name of Jian Zhehuang's last move, it's not bad. If there's a chance, we'll meet again on the battlefield outside Beiliang. Su Fengnian was taken aback. Because of Dong Tai's last words. Dong Tai, have left, but someone else has come. That sword. In the distance, there was no trace of the peach blossom sword god on the high wall beside Chao Chongqing and Luo Yang. The white-clothed woman said indifferently, Su Ying, you stay. I'm leaving. If I can avoid meeting him, I won't. Without waiting for the red-robed woman to urge her to stay, Luo Yang turned and left alone. Further away, Chai Qingshan's two disciples opened their eyes wide when Dong Tai attacked, but the girl closed her eyes. The young man and girl probably didn't know that the difference in their swordsmanship was like heaven and earth. The Jianghu bigwigs near Chai Qingshan were all shaken by Su Fengnian's blade and Dong Tai's sword and fell to the ground, battered and exhausted. When they finally managed to sit up, they were thrown off their feet again. A sword from south to north came again. But as the sword moved, the sword came again. The founding ancestor of Longhu Mountain's expression flickered. In the end, he swallowed his anger and no longer looked at Su Fengnian. He shouted to the 9 heavens, "Open the heavenly gates!" Su Fengnian gripped his blade with both hands and looked at the sky. "If you dare open the heavenly gates, then I'll cut them down as well." And then the sword came. Not only did it easily pierce through the head of the founding ancestor of Longhu Mountain, but all the other immortals in the Imperial Observatory Plaza, except for Zhao Shi and Zhao Donxia, were also beheaded. Su Fengnian had already killed immortals quickly and ruthlessly. This person seemed to be even more outstanding than the others. The young man wearing an ordinary Wudong Taoist robe arrived leisurely behind the flying sword. Without waiting for the father and son, 2 Taoist masters, to come back to their senses, he was grabbed and tossed into the sky like a chicken. Before parting, he said, "Be a good immortal. The affairs of the world will be handled by the people of the mortal world." This is where Qi Xuanzhen's fate with Dragon Tiger Mountain ends. Then, this elusive young Taoist stood in front of Su Fengnian with a smile, blocking the path of the saber. Su Fengnian flew into a rage and shouted angrily, "You with the surname Hong!" The young Taoist shrank his neck and squeezed out a smile. "His Royal Highness, you have enough burdens on your shoulders. Don't take on this burden. There's little Taoist, Wu Dang, and the hierarch Li Yufu. It's enough." Su Fengnian glared at him. The young Taoist swallowed his saliva and said softly, "I can't let your sister worry, right?" Su Fengnian muttered, "You're itching for a beating again, aren't you?" And subconsciously kicked him out of habit. The young Taoist jumped a few steps to the side. He was also used to his own cowardice. If it was many years ago, His Highness the Crown Prince would feel that his kick was very impressive. And the young Taoists on the mountain who were watching the fight between the young martial granduncle and the hedonistic Crown Prince would feel that their martial granduncle was really powerful. Every time he dodged those kicks every year, he would have the demeanor of an immortal. Now, His Royal Highness had become the King of Beiliang, one of the 4 Grandmasters of Martial Arts Evaluation. That timid but kind young martial granduncle had also become the immortal Taoist who rode a crane to Jiangnan. He had become Qi Xuanzhen and Lu Zhu. But when they met again, he was still him, and they were still them. Su Fengnian's eyes secretly reddened. He said in a hoarse voice, "You should have left the mountain earlier. 1 day earlier would have been better. My sister would have been happy for 1 more day." The young Taoist pursed his lips, wrinkled his face, and shed tears. He couldn't say anything. Su Fengnian suddenly put an arm around the young Taoist's shoulder and whispered, "With Li Yufu's help, you can still see my sister, right?" The young Taoist nodded vigorously. Su Fengnian snorted coldly. "In the future, no matter which life you are in, when you see my sister again, you must treat her well. Otherwise, I can still beat you. Lu Zhu, so what? I'm still that so-and-so and so-and-so. I have a much better background than you." A somewhat promising younger brother was afraid that his sister would be bullied when she got married and left home. They should all pretend to be evil when talking to their brother-in-law, right? The young Taoist master touched the pot that didn't boil. He wondered, didn't you cut off the karma with them? Su Fengnian, who had put the cold blade at his waist, punched the other under the armpit. The latter inhaled sharply. It was unknown if it was because of the pain or because he was pretending to be obedient like in the past. He smiled foolishly with tears on his face. Su Fengnian hesitated. You are leaving? You are really not going to be the person who defeats everything? The young Taoist master shook his head and said with a smile, I am most afraid of carrying a burden. I cannot do this kind of thing. Also, in the past I could never beat you on the mountain. Even if I could, I was used to being bullied in the past. I am still afraid. The two stood next to each other and looked at the bustling Great Peace City below them. Su Fengnian said in a voice that only he could hear, Every time I miss eldest sister, I like to think of her sitting on the back of the crane with you. At that time, she must be very happy and smiling. When I think of it this way, I am not sad. The young Taoist master did not speak. His figure was ethereal as though he would disappear with the wind in the next moment. Su Fengnian's voice became even lower. To have you. I am actually very proud. Brother-in-law. A wave of suppressed and bitter laughter came from beside him. Ah, brother-in-law. Su Fengnian flew into a rage out of humiliation and kicked him. The young Taoist master Hong Shixiang was no longer there. Su Fengnian was dazed. After a long time, he lightly landed on the square of the imperial astronomer and walked towards the crop altar. As he walked up the stairs, he bent down and grabbed a handful of soil. Su Fengnian stood at the top. He crouched down, reached out, tilted his palm and allowed the soil to slide down. The young person dressed in mourning and covered in blood closed his eyes and said to himself, Father, mother, eldest sister. I am very well. Do not worry. Chapter 1643. On this day in late autumn in the second year of Xianghu, it was destined to evolve into countless strange legends. At the imperial astronomer, the sun and moon rose, the sound of Buddha rose in spirals, and many rainbows hung in the sky. The scene in the Jianghu Southern Army's camp was also terrifying. The two immortals were like gods on earth, fighting against 10,000 people. Their figures were as fast as dragons entering the sea. In the process of the two sides fighting, the entire camp was torn into pieces. Everywhere they passed, they were unstoppable. In particular, the troops under the direct command of the new Minister of War, General Wu Zhongshuan, suffered the most. What normal people called not acclimatized to the climate was just physical discomfort. It was rare to see elite subordinates like Wu Xianxia lose their arms, legs, and even their lives. Most importantly, almost no one recognized the true identity of the two figures. This made the Jianghu Southern Army feel even more vexed. When the culprit, Su Fengnian, walked down from the crop altar, the armored soldiers of the Li family, under the leadership of Li Shogua and Li Zhongliang, vowed to guard the gate with their lives. They looked like they would step over the corpses of more than 1,000 people if they wanted to leave. In reality, more than half of the heavy cavalry outside the gate had quietly retreated out of the streets after Andong General Ma Zhongxian had frantically sent out a secret order. However, in order to not disturb the people in the inner and outer cities and not cause more panic, this cavalry that had been greatly weakened before entering the battlefield did not immediately head out of the city to their camp. Ma Zhongxian had hurriedly left his father's sickbed in the manner of General Zhenbei. He didn't even have time to put on the robes of a military official, much less put on the armor. This Andong general turned his head and looked at the remnants of the army shrouded in a tragic atmosphere. His heart bled. In particular, Ma Zhongxian, who was familiar with the officialdom of the capital, knew that once the news of his family's death spread out of the manor to the court and the marketplace, everyone in Tian City would quickly say that his father had died at the exact moment the king of Beiliang was making a ruckus at the Ministry of Rites and the imperial astronomer. He had taken his last breath because he had been scared to death by that young man surnamed Su. Ma Zhongxian clenched his fists tightly. His eyes were bloodshot. He wished he could turn his horse around and give the order to chop that Su guy into mincemeat. A plain-clothed old man walked through the Li family's fragile infantry formation. Li Shogua wanted to remind him, but the old man waved his hand with a smile and walked straight to the king of Beiliang who had stopped at the edge of the crop altar. The old man did not stand in front of the young man. The two of them walked side by side, but one of them faced north and the other faced south. Su Fengnian said indifferently, I originally thought that it would be Tantanon from the Menxia province who came here to persuade us. I didn't expect that it would be the head of the secretariat who came here to play the villain. The head of the secretariat, Qianglong, looked up at the altar and chuckled. It's a pity that the imperial astronomer was destroyed just like that. Su Fengnian said, Beiliang lost more than 100,000 men outside the Great Wall, and everyone died facing the north. Isn't that a pity? Qianglong nodded and said in a low voice, In my opinion, It's all a pity. As a scholar who likes to read history, I feel that it's a pity that the imperial astronomer was destroyed. As a citizen of Liang, I feel that it's a pity that more than 100,000 Bailiang soldiers died in battle. However, I came to the capital to ask for a robe from the imperial court to wear, so I have no choice but to come here and nag at the king. Su Fengnian's blade-wielding left hand was pierced through by the long rope. His arm drooped down, and fresh blood flowed out of his sleeve and dripped down along his fingers to the ground. His face turned pale and bloodless because of the violent qi in his body. In an instant, it turned into a dazzling purple-gold color. As for the crack between his eyebrows, fresh blood flowed down the bridge of his nose. It added a strong sense of viciousness to the handsome face of this young vassal king. This young man who had shaken the entire capital twice by himself said expressionlessly, 3,000 men. For each death, 1,000 taels of Bailiang's grain will be deducted. This is what Zhao Zhuan said himself. Then I might as well tell the head of the secretariat directly that if one of the 3 million taels of grain is missing, there will be 30,000 Bailiang cavalry going south into Guangling. Anyway, it's a matter of course for the vassal king to be in trouble. If the imperial court doesn't care about the lives of the people of Bailiang, I, Su Fengnian, am very easy to talk to. I don't mind letting you know what loyalty is. When Qi Yonglong heard these words, he didn't pretend to be angry. Instead, he smiled and said, King of Bailiang, to be honest, no matter where my ancestral home is, I, Qi Yonglong, have always regarded the Shangyin Academy of Guangling Path as my home. Yang Shenxing and Yan Zhenchuan have already messed around on my land once. That bastard Song Li and Ko Zhenghuai have done it again. Next, it will be Wu Zhongshuan and Lu Shengxiang's turn to mess around. It's fine if they can end the battle quickly. No matter who wins or loses, as long as there is a winner, it will be a good thing for the people of Guangling Path. What I'm afraid of is a stalemate. It's fine if all the young men and old soldiers die, but if all the soldiers die, won't it be the same as using the lives of the people to fill the hole? Isn't that right, King of Bailiang? Su Fengnian didn't say anything. Qi Yonglong did not look like an important official in the central government, but more like an old man who had a belly full of complaints. Now that he finally found a young man he could confide in, he could not shut up. Chao Chongqing has a knot in his heart and can't get over his own threshold. Even Duke Yanxing can't persuade him, so of course I'm not willing to waste my breath. As for those who help the imperial court to lead troops to war, I, as the head of the secretariat, can't persuade them. Moreover, the martial artists in the world make contributions on the battlefield. Whether they die on the battlefield or be conferred the title of marquis or become a general, it all depends on their own abilities. It's all up to their own destinies. It's all their reasons. I, Qi Yonglong, can't go and nag them just because I say I pity the common people in the world and say empty words like asking them to lay down their butcher's knife. At the very least, if I can persuade Lu Shang and Wu Zhongshuan, there will definitely be Ma Shang and Song Zhongshuan. After all, I can't stop the trend of the world. Qi Yonglong suddenly turned his head and stared closely at the young man whose face was covered in blood. But I think it's useful to tell you. I can't help it. You're Su Zhao's son. Su Xiao has always been very reasonable. Otherwise, why would he use gold and silver to build a 10-li-long embankment for my family in order to let that little girl Wei Xiong enter the academy? Before I came to the capital, I had to go there every morning and night regardless of rain or shine. I don't know if Su Xiao has told you before, but when he led troops to Jianghu, he passed by Shangyin Academy from Mount Longhu and made a secret visit. He blocked me in my room and took off that cold saber. Well, if I'm not wrong, it's probably the one you're hanging now. He slapped it heavily on my desk and asked me if the name, Su Fengnian, was good. Of course, I gave him a thumbs up and said it was good. It was really good. Then your father immediately became amiable and said that I, Qi Yonglong, was indeed a learned scholar. He even turned his head and asked your mother to say that I was full of military strategies. I was very happy. Of course, it wasn't because of this low-level flattery, but because in the end, your father didn't cut me with a saber. Su Fengnian raised his right hand and wiped his face. Chapter 1644. Qi Yonglong continued to look at the profound crop altar. You definitely can't imagine how much money Bailiang sent over to build the embankment. No matter how long the embankment is, how much money would it take to build the Shangyin Academy with all the manpower and material resources? However, how much money did your father secretly send over? Do you know? It was a total of 3 million taels of silver. Therefore, not only did the Xianxia Academy gain a lake embankment with willow trees, but in the next 5 years, they also secretly built a library that was the best in Jiangnan. There were no less than 200 sets of printed books in the library. In addition to the mountain of silver, there was also a light secret letter that was handed to me. The words on it were the ugliest I've ever seen. However, for more than 10 years when I had nothing else to do, I would often take it out and read it. The letter said that his eldest son would definitely be good at studying and would come to Xianxia Academy to study in the future. Perhaps in the future, the Su family would become the top scholar. That would truly bring honor to the family. If the son of a vassal king couldn't become an official, then being the top scholar wouldn't be bad either. When I first read the secret letter, I really wanted to write back and ask him, "You're a warrior who killed countless scholars. Do you have nothing better to do than let your son become a scholar? Your Su family is the most powerful official in your generation. You have both the pillar of the state and the hereditary throne in your hands. Do you really lack the title of top scholar?" I also wanted to ask him, what is 3 million taels of silver? So many people of the 8 states have died, and how many scholars have died? Can this little bit of silver compensate for the destruction of the mountains and rivers and the sinking of the central plains? You're a dignified butcher. Why don't you want your son to become a vassal king? Later, when I read the letter again, as time passed, the paper became more and more wrinkled, but my heart became calmer and calmer. During this period, I heard that after the death of the old emperor, you actually dared to sing and dance in Mount Qingliang to celebrate peace. Fireworks could be seen all over the city, and music could be heard all over the mountain. Later, you were thrown out of the gate of the prince's mansion. That was why you had 3 years of traveling. At that time, I knew that Beiliang wouldn't be content with its lot. I once hoped that you could squeeze out Chen Zhibao and succeed in becoming the king of Beiliang. However, you were willing to be a peaceful vassal king and let a general of Liang enter Beiliang. Beiliang would be Liang's Beiliang, and the people of Beiliang would be Liang's people. Half of the country's taxes would go to the Tu Liao, and the other half of the country's transportation to be transported to Beiliang. The country. B. When Su Fengnian heard this, the corners of his mouth twitched. The old man laughed self-deprecatingly. Of course, this is the wishful thinking of a pedantic scholar. Soldiers. 2. To answer. The old man waited quietly. Su Fengnian answered, 10 against 10, 50-50. 100 against 100. My Beiliang will win for sure. 1,000 against 1,000. You'll lose miserably. 10,000 against 10,000. There's no need to fight, is there? The old man smiled. Really? Su Fengnian chuckled. I'm just more educated than Su Xiao. My temper is good. The old man nodded. Yes, yes. That's why you went to the Ministry of Rights to teach the 2 assistant ministers a lesson. Then you came here alone. You didn't even give face to the Empress Dowager and started a massacre inside and outside the Imperial Astronomer. You even slaughtered a large group of immortals in heaven. Your Highness' temper is really good. Su Fengnian said unhappily, we just became friends, and now you're trying to take advantage of your seniority. Do you really think I don't have any strength left to return to Xiaoma Wei? The old man roared with laughter. All right, I've used Su Xiao to get close to you, Your Highness. If I say any more, I won't be able to keep my old face. You, Su Fengnian, can fight, and the Beiliang cavalry can fight even better. I won't hide anything and tell you everything. No matter if it's the threat of losing 1,000 shi per person or the generosity of 3 million shi of transport, it's all the young emperor's impulsiveness. As the head of the Secretariat, I don't dare to take it seriously, and I hope Your Highness doesn't take it seriously. But I dare to guarantee that from the end of this autumn to the end of next summer, Liang, especially Great Peace City, will send 1 million shi of transport to Beiliang even if they have to tighten their belts. If possible, they will send another 500,000 shi. After this, there are only 4 words. Do your best. Su Fengnian frowned. The old man said emotionally, stop while you're ahead. Both sides have a way out. In the court, from the small officials to the high officials, to those wearing official robes, and even the dragon robes, there has never been a happy person. Without waiting for Su Fengnian to speak, the old man sighed and said, I don't know if I'm mistaken, but even though there are more and more young faces in the court, when I'm among them, I feel a sense of lethargy. Maybe after the white-robed monk Li Xiaoxin's almanac was rejected, Jianghu also feels the same sadness as me. The old man turned his head and stared at the heavily injured young man. In Bai Yan Er's book of poems that may never be circulated, he said that there are two great joys and one great hatred in life. In the Jianghu, having chivalry in a dangerous place is one of the joys. On the battlefield, picking up a blade in the face of death is one of the great joys. Every time I read in a book that the historians like to skim over, piles of bones, the people are in a terrible situation, it is a great hatred. The old man said with a smile. Pitifully, this blue-eyed man died early. On the map of Liang dynasty, which he had glanced at many times, there was a place where the names of hundreds of thousands of dead people were engraved on a stone tablet. In the history books that generations of scholars read, there are no longer only the names of winners and losers. Earlier, there was a fellow who said that he had seen you and showed off in front of me. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that I couldn't disobey the emperor's orders, I wouldn't have come here to be bullied. What's so good about you, Su Fengnian? I'm an old man, not one of those young ladies who admire young heroes. Hey, when I was young, I might have been even more handsome than you, Su Fengnian said. Then it's settled. The old man asked, then when will your highness leave the capital? Su Fengnian walked forward. The day after tomorrow. The old man looked at this figure and asked with a smile, if you can't today, how about tomorrow? There's nothing to see in Great Peace City. Su Fengnian stopped walking, turned around and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, tomorrow? Fine. Lord Head of the Secretariat wants to see the stone tablet? Then this king will personally take you there. The old man's smile froze. The day after tomorrow it is. Early in the morning, I will personally go to the Demoyai post station and knock on the door. Su Fengnian ignored this shameless old man and walked to the gates of the imperial astronomer. The old man behind him raised his hands and waved them to the sides. The armored soldiers of the Li family quickly scattered to the left and right, leaving a wide path. Suddenly, the old man quickly caught up to Su Fengnian and grabbed Su Fengnian's right hand, unwilling to let go. Su Fengnian turned to look at this old man whose expression had suddenly turned solemn. The old man lowered his voice and said, Su Fengnian, you have to make sure that fewer people die in this world. Su Fengnian wanted to turn and leave. The old man seemed to have the strength from somewhere and gripped Su Fengnian's hand tightly, his face red. Su Fengnian could have just waved his sleeve and broken free, but for some reason, Su Fengnian sighed softly and nodded. He said helplessly, do I need to say it? The old man finally released his hand. After walking a few steps, Su Fengnian heard the old man say in a small voice, if I don't do this, I can't show that I, Qi Yonglong, am a savior. Su Fengnian's lips twitched. He raised his right arm, extended his thumb, and then pointed down. He looked at the back of the young man. The old man said again, well, he has some of my style when I was young. Perhaps he felt that he was too far away and the young king couldn't hear his mutterings, so when the king of Bailiang suddenly turned his head, the old man turned his back with lightning speed. He put his hands behind his back and walked quickly to the crop altar, as if he was in a hurry to go there to enjoy the scenery. The old man and the young man walked with their backs facing each other. The old man restrained the expression on his face and said in his heart, Green Eyes, if you were still alive, would you grit your teeth and not open the ban on the transport of grain, or would you go against all opinions and open the transport of grain? No matter what, I'm not as good as you. The old man stood at the top of the crop altar and looked at the dazzling loose soil. He slowly squatted down. Su Shao, Zhang Julu. You two fought for half your lives when you were alive. After you died and went underground, you would actually drink together, right? At the gate of the imperial astronomer, there was a girl who was holding a scallion pancake in one hand and rubbing her mink hat with the other. Su Fengnian walked over and bent down to help her adjust her mink hat. Then, a bright red robe fluttered over like a butterfly. She arrived in front of Su Fengnian and spun in an ethereal manner. Su Fengnian waited for her to stop and nodded with a soft smile. You still look good. Su Fengnian held the two people's hands and said, let's go back to the post house first. We'll go home together the day after tomorrow. Su Yanbing had returned to the carriage at the gate of the imperial astronomer. He had already put away the spear. Su Fengnian wiped the blood that just oozed out from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand and said with a smile, You're back so soon? This spear is really fast. Su Yanbing, who was confused for a moment, nodded. When the young lord sat in the carriage, and the carriage drove for a long distance, Su Yanbing, who finally realized what was going on, laughed and scolded. Mother asterisk cur, you don't even use a dirty word when cursing people. After laughing, Su Yanbing looked into the distance and was a little lost in thought. The girl wearing the mink hat and the woman wearing the red robe didn't sit in the carriage for some reason. Inside the carriage, the young man who was covered in blood took off his cold sword, held the king's robe with both hands, and buried his head in it. His shoulders trembled. No expression. No crying. Chapter 1645. A middle-aged man with a refined appearance appeared outside the Demoyi post house. The post house officer looked at this man who gave him a strange feeling. He heard that he called himself Wuxia and said that he could enter as long as he reported his arrival to the king of Beiliang. The post house officer saw his outstanding bearing and did not dare to slight him. However, when the post house officer did not see the prince, he was stopped by the man surnamed Su, who was acting as a coachman. The two of them walked back to the post house together. Su Yanbing and Wu Qi stood separately outside the post house officer's door. The latter smiled and said, "Long time no see." Su Yanbing had no intention of letting him pass. His eyes were cold as he said, "Since you did not show your face in Beimang, isn't it too late for you to come now? What, do you think that being a general in Western Shu is not satisfying enough?" Wu Qi laughed loudly and said, "Lu Yanbing. Oh, that's not right. I heard that you bestowed the surname Su to my brother-in-law, so I should call you Su Yanbing now. Regardless of whether I am in Northern Mang or Western Shu, when an uncle comes to visit his nephew, you are going to stop him?" Su Yanbing laughed coldly and said, "If you want to die, I won't stop you." Wu Qi sniffled and said, "What a temper. No wonder you are a martial arts grandmaster who is on par with the king of Shu. You don't have to beat me to death. I'm scared to death." Suddenly, the man who called himself the king of Beiliang's uncle shouted, "Nephew!" There was a loud bang. Wu Qi slid back dozens of feet from the Demoyi post house officer's door. Su Yanbing slowly retracted his foot. He even rubbed the soles of his feet on the door sill as if he was afraid of dirtying his boots. Wu Qi, who had leaned back but didn't fall to the ground, stood up straight and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He didn't get angry and continued to walk to the door. At this time, Su Fengnian, who had changed into clean clothes, was already at the door. Su Yanbing moved aside. Wu Qi put away his frivolous expression, and no longer had any thoughts of barging into the post house. He stood outside the door and said, "I, Wu Qi, have never thought of four things in my life. My sister married Su Xiao, Su Xiao did not rebel against Liang, and you protected Beiliang and left the imperial astronomer alive." Su Fengnian's expression was complicated. "Why don't you come in and have a cup of tea?" Wu Qi shook his head and said, "No. Regardless of whether I'm right or wrong, I don't regret my actions. Since I didn't show myself to meet my nephew in Northern Mang back then, I don't have the right to enter today." Su Fengnian asked, "So you have something to say?" Wu Qi still shook his head. "I just came to tell you that your trip to Beimang was not in vain. Li Yishan has already begun to make some moves. But let me remind you that even so, don't expect them to help you in your hour of need. It's best if you don't even think about adding flowers to the brocade. Beimang's peace order might be alerted to this. Be careful of the oriole behind you." Su Fengnian nodded. "I know." Wu Qi grinned. "If there really comes a day when we fight on the battlefield, Chen Zhibao will not show mercy. I will do the same. I hope you can do the same." Su Fengnian said, "No problem." Wu Qi was just about to speak when he heard his nephew considerately remind him, "If you want to vomit blood, vomit it for a while." Wu Qi's face immediately darkened. He coldly harumphed, clutching his chest as he turned around and left. Su Yanbing glanced at his departing figure. He held back his laughter and said softly, "That kick of mine was not heavy." Su Fengnian grunted. "That's why I said that." Su Yanbing was speechless. That sentence seemed to have been much heavier than his kick. Su Yanbing suddenly turned his head. Su Fengnian helplessly said, "Forget it." The red-robed woman and a certain young girl not far away, who had been itching to give it a try, finally gave up. Su Yanbing laughed. "Then I'll go find some wine to drink. The post house doesn't even have a bottle of green ant wine. That's too unreasonable." After saying this, Su Yanbing walked towards a restaurant on the street. Unlike yesterday's Demoyi post house, where the majority of the guests were men, the seats of today's restaurants inns, and tea houses were all filled with women. There were young women, plump women, and even many young girls who were in the prime of their lives. When Su Fengnian appeared at the entrance to see Wu Qi, almost at the same time, flower hairpin women poked their heads out of the windows, their eyes shining brightly. There were those who were full of affection, those who were bold enough to cast amorous glances at him, and those who were shy and wanted to say something. There were also bold and unrestrained women who were shamelessly shouting the name of the king of Bailiang. Su Yanbing had not even entered the restaurant when countless handkerchiefs, round fans, scented sachets floated above his head. A large shower of fragrant incense. These women were all saying things like, "I'll have to trouble this Bailiang warrior to give this fan to his highness." There were even more women who ran out of their rooms. They did not dare to approach Su Yanbing. In any case, they threw the letters in their hands at him and turned to flee. Even the half-step Marshal Saint Su Yanbing could not withstand this terrifying array. On both sides of the street, soft whispers could be heard from upstairs and downstairs. See, I told you a long time ago that my young master Su is the most handsome man in the world, but you didn't believe me. Now you've gone crazy. My eyes are about to get pregnant. If His Highness can walk out of the post house and get a little closer to hear him say a few words, even if I die, it will be worth it. All the handsome young masters of our great peace city added together can't compare to my big brother Su. I can't. He's really too handsome. Just looking at him from afar makes me drunk. It's a pity that I couldn't sneak out yesterday. Otherwise, I would have been able to see His Highness's heroic figure. Lend me your shoulder, I want to cry for a while. I've decided. In this life, I will only marry young Master Su. If that doesn't work, I'll just be a maidservant. Su Yanbing patted a scented sachet off his shoulder and decisively turned to walk back to the post house. He wondered if he should have His Highness leave Great Peace City as soon as possible. Weren't the women of the capital a little too formidable? Su Fengnian had already brought Jia and Su Ying back to the courtyard. He was dressed in purple and had come uninvited to lie down on a rattan chair under the eaves, resting with his eyes closed. Su Fengnian had also brought over a rattan chair. The woman in red who had taken off her veil crouched down next to Su Fengnian. The chuckling girl sat on the steps and had pulled out a scallion pancake from somewhere and was nibbling on it. Su Fengnian lay down on the chair and softly asked, "Why haven't you returned to Mount Hui yet?" Shenyuan Qingfeng did not speak. Su Fengnian opened his eyes and looked at the eaves. That year when he had entered the capital, it had also been at the post house in Great Peace City, on a rattan chair in this courtyard. Su Fengnian had talked to this crazy woman about snowmen and ideals. It was also at that time that the idiot with the wooden sword had left the Jianghu. Shenyuan Qingfeng did not open his eyes. He coldly asked, "After all these years, have you pitied me or yourself?" Su Fengnian smiled. "Both." Shenyuan Qingfeng fell silent. Su Fengnian said, "Thank you for helping me suppress Qi Jiajia's sword aura yesterday." Shenyuan Qingfeng coldly said, "You owe me the title of #1 in the world." Su Fengnian snickered. I know. As long as it's business, I guarantee that I'll be honest with everyone." Shenyuan Qingfeng started working and muttered to himself, "Business, huh?" In the next moment, there was only a light breeze under the eaves. Su Fengnian turned his head and looked at the rattan chair without purple clothes. He stood up and sat next to the chuckling girl. She took out another scallion pancake and placed it in front of Su Fengnian without turning her head. Su Fengnian took the slightly hard pancake and ate it in big bites. The red-robed Su Ying stood in the middle of the courtyard. Su Fengnian mumbled, "Turn around." The red pancake spun non-stop, pleasing to the eye. Su Fengnian smiled brightly. After the head of the secretariat, Qi Yonglong, left the imperial astronomer, the old man was personally led by the head eunuch of the ceremony directorate, Song Tonglu, to a small hall located between the inner and outer court of Liang, the Hall of Immortality. The newly built Hall of Immortality was located in the inner court, but it was closely connected to the outer court. In addition, there were a total of 12 scholars who handled government affairs near the Hall of Immortality. This made the Hall of Immortality, which had been abandoned for many years, into a veritable central location. The Hall of Immortality did not take up much space. It was in the shape of an I shape, a typical front hall and back bedroom. In the hall hung a large plaque with the words, "Fair and Peaceful," written by the late Emperor Zhao Dun. Recently, The small court meetings that the young emperor personally hosted had all been moved here. The introductions of important officials were also carried out here. A number of newly appointed officials, such as Tianzong, Donggong, and Huang Weidong, the leader of the old Green Party of the previous dynasty, Hong Lingshu, the general of Nanjiang who had replaced Liu Baijie as the Minister of War, and the head of the Peng family of Liaodong who had succeeded Han Lin as the Assistant Minister of Justice, had all come here to meet the emperor. When Qi Yonglong stepped into the Hall of Immortality, Huan Wen, the head of the province, and Chen Wang, the assistant of the scattered left cavalry, were already present. Zhao Yuling, who was in charge of the secretariat, and Yin Mao Chun, the heavenly official of the Ministry of Personnel, who had different political views, were also present. However, the two of them stood far apart. Not only did they not have a harmonious atmosphere, but they also seemed to be estranged from each other. Of the 6 grand scholars, only Wen Shouren, the grand scholar of the Hall of Wuying, and Yan Jieshi, the grand scholar of the Dongyuan Pavilion, were present. None of the newly established grand scholar of the Guangha Pavilion showed up. Other than that, there was also Zhao Yang, the commandery prince of Chongshan, Gao Shizhi, the Duke of Yan, and Song Downing, the Marquis of Huaiyang. 4 ordinary officials of Liang. These 3 were low-key people who had long heard of their names but never met. Compared to these important people who either held the power of the court or had a thunderous reputation, the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War, Tang Taizuang, was still a junior even though he had a lot of power. Therefore, his position was at the back, and he stood right next to Wen Taiyi, the leader of the Green Party in Great and City. Wen Taiyi was a legendary figure in the Great and City officialdom. He sat on the seat of the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, and hadn't moved from his seat for more than 10 years. He had worked for 3 ministers of the Ministry of Personnel, so there was always a joke in the Ministry of Personnel that, the Minister of Flowing Water, the Assistant Minister of Iron. Even Tantanon often used old Assistant Minister of One to tease Wen Taiyi. Therefore, almost everyone forgot that this old Assistant Minister was not yet 50 years old. Chapter 1646. Qi Yonglong had actually stopped outside the room for a moment. If it were someone else, head eunuch Song Tonglu would have hurriedly urged him to hurry up. However, it was a different matter if it was the head of the secretariat. Song Tonglu stood quietly outside the room with the old man. Inside the room came the old scholar Wen Shouren's signature loud voice. It was full of vigor. It was hard to believe that this was the voice of an old man. The noble old man who led the hall said with grief and indignation, "Your Majesty, the northern Liang barbarians are really rude. Not only did they discredit the Ministry of Rights, they even made a scene at the imperial astronomer. The imperial court can't tolerate him anymore. Otherwise, where will the imperial court's face be? Your Majesty, although this old subject is a scholar, I still have a set of old bones and a backbone that does not weaken despite my age. This old subject will go to the Damayi courier station alone and arrest that barbarian and throw him into prison. If he dares to kill anyone, then kill this old subject as well. I only hope that your Majesty will punish him for this later. Even if this old subject dies, it will be a worthy death." Song Tonglu lowered his gaze, but the head of the Hall of Secretaries rolled his eyes too obviously. The head eunuch could still see it clearly. Inside the room, Zhao Yang, the commandery prince of Chongshan, who was about the same age as Wen Shouren, looked at the juniors beside him, Duke Gao and Marquis Song. The latter two were obviously speechless. The 3 of them had closed their doors and refused to ask about the imperial court for too many years. Their circle of activity was limited to the nobles and the relatives of the emperor. They had almost no contact with outside officials. In the past, they had only heard that Grand Scholar One was unyielding in the imperial court. Today they saw him in a new light. The old commandery prince of Chongshan slowly withdrew his gaze and frowned. As an old member of the Liang royal family, Zhao Yang, the commandery prince of Chongshan, had personally experienced the beginning and end of the Spring and Autumn War. When the emperor bestowed rewards, Zhao Yang, who should have been in the top 10 in terms of contributions, only received a humiliating title of commandery prince because of a secret matter. After that, he began to play with flowers, birds, fish, and insects in peace, leisurely enjoying the rest of his life. There were very few men in the manner of Chongshan commandery prince. Over time, this old commandery prince was completely forgotten. If Song Downing, who could barely be called a young and healthy man, was going to make a big move when he returned to the court, then the old commandery prince at this age seemed to be just doing his best. Grand Scholar One, who was famous for carrying the coffin and remonstrating to death, began to count the major crimes of the young king after the hereditary succession. He was impassioned and the room was full of righteousness. This wooing palace grand secretary was obviously going to fight to the death with the Su family. There had been rumors in Graydon City for many years that Grand Scholar One was so paranoid that he did not have a good attitude toward any official in Jianghu with the surname Su. One of the two biggest topics of discussion in Graydon City in the past half a year had to do with the One family. It was said that the granddaughter of the Grand Scholar One, who was spoiled to the heavens, not only said that she wanted to go to the northwest to see the new Prince Liang, she almost really ran away from home and successfully eloped. Sir One was so angry that he fell seriously ill and was bedridden for half a year. During this time, Jean Lanting of the Ministry of Rights had visited him no less than 3 times. However, looking at Wen Shoren's vigor, it did not seem like it. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Appointments, Wan Taiyi, was in this room. Although his rank was the same as Chen Wang and Tang Tai's Huang, even he knew the difference. As one of the 3 chariots of the Green Party, of the other 2, Lu Feiqi of Xianghu State had passed away. The Lu family had married into Beiliang and moved to Beiliang. The general of Qingzhou, Hong Lingshu, had entered Jingdo from a local area. It was not clear whether the overall power of the Green Party had increased or decreased. However, the present emperor wanted to reappoint officials of the Green Party. This was an undeniable trend. Wei Dong, who had also come from Qingzhou, had just become the #1 person in the Guangling Navy and Qingzhou Navy. This conjecture was confirmed. Yin Maochun had not been in charge of the Ministry of Appointments for long. It was not very likely that Wen Taiyi, the left assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments, would become the heavenly official of Liang. However, it was not impossible for him to be the leader of another department. He had a certain chance of being in charge of the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Works, and Ministry of Revenue. Today, Wen Taiyi's sudden appearance here caused Zhao Yuling and Yin Maochun to look at him a few more times. The young emperor did not interrupt when the scholar's impassioned speech of righteousness and plain-spoken integrity. However, when Qi Yonglong crossed the threshold, the group of powerful officials turned their heads in unison and made Wen Shoren stop himself. He followed the others and bowed respectfully to the head of the secretariat. Qi Yonglong stood where the Grand Secretary should stand. After bowing to the emperor, he said concisely, "I have just seen the king of Beiliang. He has agreed to leave Jingdo the day after tomorrow. Regarding the lifting of the ban on the transport of grain, the king of Beiliang hopes that the court can send 500,000 dan of grain to Beiliang before autumn next year." A trace of confusion appeared in Huan Wen's eyes. He couldn't help but turn his head to look at the head of the palace secretariat standing beside him. He noticed that when Qi Yonglong said the number 500,000 dan, the palm in his sleeve made a small gesture in front of him. Commandery Prince Chongshan's eyelids drooped in disappointment. As for the reason, probably only the old commandery prince himself knew. Tang Tai's Huang of the Ministry of War, who was sitting at the very back, smiled coldly. "You, Su Fengnian, have caused such a great storm in Great Peace City, yet you only dare to ask for 500,000 dan of grain from the court? Could it be that Great Peace City is no longer your territory and you don't even have the courage to ask for an exorbitant price?" The young emperor sitting on the couch breathed gently. A smile flashed across his face. He swept his gaze over the important officials of Liang and asked calmly, "Dear officials, what do you think?" When Shoren was about to jump out and scold the new prince of Liang when he heard Chen Wang, who was standing in the same row as him and Yan Jieshi, speak first. "I believe that the king of Beiliang is the king of Beiliang, and the people of Beiliang are the people of Beiliang. The 500,000 dan of grain can agree to lift the ban and send it to the way of Beiliang." When Shoren immediately closed his mouth and swallowed back the grand speech that was about to come out of his mouth. The old scholar was able to put on the airs of an old official of 3 dynasties in front of Jin Sanlang, but for some reason, when Shoren felt uneasy about Chen Xiaobao, whom he had never interacted with before. When they met occasionally, he would take the initiative to be friendly. Unfortunately, official Chen never showed any signs of looking at him in a different light. This made Wen Shoren feel regret deep in his heart, as well as some unknown apprehension. Commandery Prince Chongshan, Zhao Yang, who had not spoken in court for many years, said coldly, "Your Majesty, the Beiliang soldiers who died fighting outside the pass are worthy of 500,000 dan of grain as a reward. It would not be too much to say that lifting the ban and sending 1 million dan of grain is not an exaggeration. But this Su Fengnian, as a vassal king, has no regard for the law in the capital. We cannot make an exception and encourage his arrogance. Thus, I believe that not a single dan of grain can be given to Su Fengnian. The Grand Secretary of Dongyuan Pavilion, Yan Jieshi, also agreed. Your Majesty, I agree with Commander Prince Changshan's opinion. The Bailiang people and soldiers have performed meritorious deeds, but the King of Bailiang has made a grave mistake. Thus, meritorious deeds and demerits should offset each other, and the rewards and punishments should be clear. This is in accordance with the laws of the imperial court. Tang Taizuang said in a low voice, Your Majesty, I am willing to personally escort the King of Bailiang out of the capital and its environs today. The young emperor did not comment. He looked around and finally saw Wen Tai, who was standing at the back and was half a head shorter than Assistant Minister Tang. He asked warmly, Assistant Minister Wen, do you have anything to say? Wen Tai said without hesitation, I believe that the lifting of the ban on Bailiang's transport of grain can be given, but not too much. It can be done slowly but not urgently. There was a secret room on the right side of the Hall of Spiritual Cultivation. On the wall of the secret room's west door, there was a large map with the names of officials written in small characters. It took up more than half of the wall. A young man stood at the bottom of the wall. He raised his head, but his eyes were tightly shut. He was a blind man dressed in white who stood at the center of Liang. Although the young blind man could not see the contents of the map, he could feel the indescribable grandeur. In the Liang dynasty, almost all important officials, whether civil or military, would have a place on the map as long as they reached the threshold of the 4th rank. From the capital to the various provinces and counties, from the 3 provinces and 6 ministries to the provincial governors and governors, from the great general of punitive expedition to the general of a province, they were all written on the map. Among them, there were very few names and their official positions. 2 concise and comprehensive evaluations were written in black and red small characters. One came from Yin Mao Chun, and the other came from Zhao Go. The young blind man looked at the map as if he was looking at the whole of Liang. When he heard Wen Tai's strategy of, not too much, not too little. It can be done slowly but not urgently, the young man smiled knowingly. He approved of the strategy, but also mocked it playfully. The young emperor said, The matter of the transport of grain will be discussed tomorrow. Today, I want to discuss with everyone the candidate for the Jianghu magistrate. Almost everyone understood. No wonder Assistant Minister Wen would make an exception and make an appearance today. There was nothing to discuss. Nowadays, when it came to the promotion of officials, the young emperor's words carried enormous weight. The head of the secretariat, Qi Yonglong, and the provincial governor, Huan Wen, never had any objections. In addition, Chen Wang, who never missed a small court meeting, and Yin Mao Chun, who always understood tacitly, all appointments went smoothly. Thus, even if Wen Tai, who was born in Qingzhou, was sent out to be the head of the civil officials of Jianghu, which slightly violated the rules of Liang, no one would use such a trivial matter to argue with the emperor. Moreover, Wen Tai had been the second in command of the Ministry of Appointments responsible for distributing official hats for more than a decade. Who was willing to offend this future young magistrate with deep roots? Not yet 50 years old, but jumping ranks from assistant minister of the 6 ministries to local magistrate, he was clearly going to return to court. His future was promising. Perhaps within 10 years at most, there would be another rank 2 big boss in the capital. When Shorin quickly proposed that Assistant Minister Wen was the best candidate. Who did not know that the great and great Wens of Great Peace City were famous for being inseparable? Chapter 1647. After the emperor made the final decision, Wen Tai naturally knelt down to thank him and shed tears of gratitude. After Wen Tai, who was about to return to his hometown as the Jianghu magistrate, stood up, a tall old general wearing the robes of a standard second-rank military official walked into the room. After bowing and asking for forgiveness, he stood near Tang Taizuang without saying a word. Gao Shizhi and Song Downing quietly looked at each other and smiled. The Minister of War had actually held himself back from complaining on the spot. Most likely, other than the 2 Grand Secretaries and the newly promoted Wen Tai, most of the people present had already heard of the disturbance in the Jingji Southern Army camp. The Southern Expedition General's men had suffered heavy casualties. They only knew that 2 martial arts grandmasters who used spears had fought. As for who it was, they didn't even see their faces. What followed was a tepid question-and-answer session. The young emperor focused on asking Wu Zhongshuan about the recent situation of the Guangling War. An hour later, this far-reaching court meeting ended. Only Qi Yonglong, Huan Wen, Chen Wang, and Wu Zhongshuan remained. Emperor Zhao Zhuan led the 3 civil officials into the secret room. The 2 old men were stunned when they saw the young man. Zhao Zhuan smiled and introduced him. "This is Lu Su from Qingzhou. He is very knowledgeable. My original intention was for Mr. Lu to become one of the teachers of the diligent room, but Mr. Lu refused. So that Mr. Lu temporarily does not have an official position to teach in the diligent room." The blind Lu Su stood beside the emperor and said calmly, "Greetings, my lords." Huanwen nodded and smiled but didn't say anything. Qi Yonglong was expressionless and made a low sound of acknowledgement. The diligent room was the study place of the emperor's descendants. Was this to pave the way for the white-robed minister? Huanwen suddenly looked at Qi Yonglong and asked, "Lord Head of the Secretariat, since we're here, why don't we get straight to the point?" Previously, Qi Yonglong had said in front of a large group of people that Bailiang had begged the court for 500,000 stones of grain transport. Of course, it was to help the young emperor gain face. When Shorin, this stupid scholar, would take it seriously. Many others were also skeptical, but Tantanon would never take it seriously. Qi Yonglong pretended to be confused and looked around. Where did this skylight come from? Huan was fuming with rage. He wanted to settle accounts with the head of the secretariat. Zhao Zhuan already smiled and said, "I plan to allow Bailiang to transport millions of shur of grain. In the future, Wen Taiyi, who oversees Qingzhou, will have full authority to handle this matter." "Sir Qi, Tantanon, is this appropriate?" Qi Yonglong nodded. Huanwen pondered for a moment. "That's the only way." Zhao Zhuan turned to look at the Minister of War, who was filled with a murderous aura. "General Wu has been wronged. I will have people thoroughly investigate the matter of the Jingji Southern Army Camp. Before General Wu returns to Guangling Road, I will definitely give you an explanation." Wu Zhongshuan cupped his fists and said, "Since your Majesty has such intentions, this general has nothing to say. Please rest assured, Your Majesty, this general is not the kind of official who cannot see the big picture." Zhao Zhuan looked satisfied. Huanwen hesitated and finally couldn't help but ask, "Your Majesty, whether it is Wen Taiyi or the King of Jing'an, they all have old grievances with Bailiang Su family. If they overlook official business for personal reasons and delay the important matters of the court, what will happen then?" Zhao Zhuan smiled and said, "The King of Jing'an and Zhao Sun are undoubtedly loyal. Wen Taiyi's knowledge and achievements are praised. After taking on this important task, I believe that he will not dare to be careless in the matter of the transport." Huanwen continued unabashedly, "Our Liang's transport is divided into north and south. The southern transport is mainly based on the Guangling River, while the northern transport is mainly based on the canals. This has also given rise to 2 stubborn factions. Wen Taiyi had a deep grudge with the head of the southern transport in his early years. I'm afraid that even if Wen Taiyi is sincere in his work, the southern transport will make things difficult for him from top to bottom. Furthermore, the Qingzhou General Hong Lingshu, who could originally balance the transport of more than 100,000 troops, is now in the capital. In Lao Chen's opinion, if Wen Taiyi is appointed as the Jingandao Jingshi, we still need to send a deputy Jidushi, whose prestige is not weak. Other than intimidating the snakes and insects in the hinterland of the Central Plains, we can also conveniently clean up the mud that has accumulated for many years in the south." Although Huanwen was somewhat overbearing, Zhao Zhuan still nodded with a smile. "If that's the case, what does Tantanon think of Anong General Ma Xianliang leaving the capital to take up the post of deputy Jidushi?" Huanwen was somewhat surprised. Chen Wang was about to speak. Whether it was his ability to lead troops in battle, his reputation in the army, or his family background, Ma Zhongxian's promotion from a 3rd-rank Anqi general to a 2nd-rank deputy Jidushi in the vassal king's territory, as well as a promotion within the military official system, there were no major problems to be found. However, as the son of Ma Lulong, Ma Zhongxian's departure would be enough to suppress the transport officials. Perhaps he could really take back the power of the transport from the hands of the various nobles and return it to the imperial court. However, this would inevitably go against the original intention of ensuring the smooth transport of the transport. Wen Taiyi and the Bailiang Su family didn't get along. Wasn't this even more so? Just as Chen Wang was thinking about what to say, he suddenly felt his sleeve being pulled. Turning his head, he saw Lu Su looking ahead, as if he didn't reach out to stop Chen Wang. Chen Wang was very cautious and quickly dismissed the idea of advising him. At the same time, Chen Wang was somewhat shocked. How did Lu Su know that he was going to speak? After another hour, the officials left the secret chamber. Wu Zhongshuan smiled and said goodbye to the other four, taking large strides away. Qi Yonglong and Huan Wen walked side by side. As the old man of the diligent department, Chen Wang led the newcomer Lu Su there. The two old men and the two newcomers happened to be walking in different directions, with their backs facing each other. Chen Wang said softly, "Thank you." Lu Su's expression was indifferent, as if he didn't hear. On the other side, Huan Wen, who didn't need the palace eunuchs to lead the way, sighed emotionally. "It's different now." Qi Yonglong said something disrespectful. "What, is Tantanon unhappy that your majesty isn't the emperor?" Huan Wen said angrily. "Bullshit." The head of the secretariat pretended to sniff. "The autumn air is refreshing, the osmanthus fragrance refreshes the mind. Where did this stinky fart come from?" Huan Wen snorted coldly and quickened his pace, obviously unwilling to continue walking side by side with the head of the secretariat. Qi Yonglong didn't stop him, but also quickened his pace, laughing softly. "At the imperial astronomer, the king of Baelyong personally praised my knowledge as the best in the world. Tantanon, what do you think?" Huan Wen turned his head to look at the head of the secretariat, who was full of pride, and said disdainfully, "Who are you trying to fool?" This time, it was Qi Yonglong's turn to stride forward. Huan Wen looked at the back of this figure and muttered, "Is that kid blind? Or does this old man have a beautiful granddaughter at home, and that kid is thinking about her?" When the lady boss of Jiujiu restaurant was personally led into the small courtyard by Su Yanbing, she saw a scene that made her not know whether to laugh or cry. The king of Baelyong was sitting on a small bench, scrubbing his extremely luxurious royal robe. The problem was that the young man's movements were very skillful. Su Fengnian had just finished washing the clothes. After wringing them dry, he quickly dried them on the bamboo poles that had already been